has been a contested matter. In the first referendum in 1975, the British people voted to stay in, but almost a third of those who voted wanted to leave. Indeed, there are those in this chamber who campaigned to leave at that time. And as the EEC evolved into a European Union of increasing political depth, the British people's doubts about our membership grew. Ultimately, membership of any union that involves the pooling of sovereignty can only be sustained with the consent of the people. In the referendum of 2016, the biggest democratic exercise in our history, the British public withdrew that consent. They confirmed.
Very grateful, Honourable Lady. The Honourable Lady has lost in the Supreme Court. The Honourable Lady has lost in the European courts. And today the Honourable Lady has lost in this House. I hope the Honourable Lady will not compound that by opposing a Section 30 for Scotland when the Scottish Government wants it. Her history of opposition is not a good one, and she should respect the democracy she's talking about. It applies to Scotland too, Prime Minister.
Prime Minister.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that, as I said, I've just referred to the fact that membership of any union that involves the pooling of sovereignty can only be sustained with the consent of the people. In 2016, that consent was withdrawn by the British public in relation to our membership of the European Union. In 2014, when the people of Scotland were asked whether to remain in the United Kingdom, they voted to stay in the United Kingdom. As I've just repeated, in the referendum in 2016, the British people withdrew that consent, and they confirmed that choice a year later by voting overwhelmingly for parties that committed to delivering Brexit. The referendum was a vote to bring our EU membership to an end and to create a new role for our country in the world. And to deliver on that vote, we need to deliver a Brexit that respects the decision of the British people. A Brexit that takes back control of our borders, laws and money, and a Brexit that sets ourselves on course for a better future outside the EU as a globally trading nation in charge of our own destiny and seizing the opportunities of trade with some of the fastest growing and most dynamic economies across the world.
I'm very grateful for the Prime Minister for giving way. But having read this agreement, it seems to me we will not be able to enter into trade agreements because we're going to be stuck with the same rule base that we have in the EU. Does my Right Honourable Prime Minister agree?
Prime Minister.
I don't think my honourable friend will be surprised if I say that I don't agree with the analysis that she's just given in relation to the agreement. It is clear that we will have an independent trade policy, that we will be able to negotiate trade deals around the rest of the world. This is a specific issue. This is a specific issue that we looked at when we were putting forward our own proposals in the summer in relation to our future economic partnership with the European Union. And I heard somebody from the Labour benches from a sedentary position saying when will we be able to negotiate our trade deals. During the implementation period, we will be able to negotiate, sign and ratify trade deals around the world. Mr. Speaker, this will only be a moment of opportunity if we in this House can find a way to deliver Brexit that begins to bring our country back together. That means protecting the easy trading relationship that supports just-in-time supply chains and the jobs that depend on them, the security cooperation that keeps us safe, the progress we've made in Northern Ireland. The progress we've made in Northern Ireland and the rights of citizens here in the UK and across the European Union. I will give way to the honourable.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. She spoke of security cooperation. Yet when I asked the Home Secretary the other day whether we would be left more safe or less safe as a result of this deal, he couldn't answer the question because he couldn't guarantee that we would have access to the crucial SIS2 database that ensures we have information on terrorists, paedophiles and other criminals trying to cross our border. That's the reality of the deal that she's put before us.
Prime Minister.
I say to the honourable gentleman that, as he knows full well, I think, the political declaration and the security section of that political declaration goes well beyond any security arrangement that the European Union has with any other country. And it And it makes clear that in the next stage of negotiations, we will be negotiating how we can have access to the very elements that are covered by both SIS2 and ECRIS. So that, no, I say to the honourable gentleman, perhaps he'd like to look at the political declaration. The reference to those elements is indeed in the political declaration. And if he says, I'm sorry, if the honourable gentleman says from a sedentary position that they are not, then I have to say to him that he may not understand the elements that lie behind SIS2 and ECRIS. I'm going to make some progress for a minute. Mr. Speaker, to achieve all of those things that I've just set out, in terms of protecting our trading relationship, the security cooperation, the progress in Northern Ireland and the rights of citizens, requires some compromise. Now, I know there are some in this House and in the country who would prefer a closer relationship with the European Union than the one I'm proposing. Indeed, who would prefer the relationship that we currently have and want another referendum which they hope would overturn the decision we took in 2016. Although I profoundly disagree, they are arguing for what they believe is right for our country, and I respect that. But the hard truth is that we will not settle this issue and bring our country together that way. And I ask them to think what it would say to the 52% who came out to vote leave, in many cases for the first time in decades, if their decision were ignored. What would it do to our politics? There are others. And I say to honourable members, I will take a significant number of interventions, but I will make some progress at this stage. These are important points because there are those who want a closer relationship with the EU, but they do need to recognise the message that was given by the 52% who voted to leave the European Union. There are others in this House who would prefer a more distant relationship than the one I'm proposing. And although I don't agree, I know they're also arguing for what they think is best for our future, and I respect that too. But the hard truth is also that we will not settle this issue and bring our country together if in delivering Brexit we do not protect the trade and security cooperation on which so many jobs and lives depend, completely ignoring the views of the 48%. We can shut our eyes to these hard truths and carry on debating between these extremes for months to come, or we can accept that the only solution that will endure is one that addresses the concerns of those who voted leave while reassuring those who voted remain. That this, I will take a number of interventions in a minute when I've just finished this. That this argument has gone on long enough. It is corrosive to our politics, and life depends on compromise. I take the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. My constituency split pretty much down the middle during the referendum. But can I explain to the Prime Minister the crux of the problem that she has next week? She set as the benchmark on security cooperation, things being better than the relationship the EU had with other countries. The problem the Prime Minister has, my constituents who voted leave voted for a better future for our country. My constituents who voted remain wanted to protect all that we have good with the European Union. With the deal she's negotiated, she's brought those two groups together, but against her deal.
I say to the honourable gentleman is what this deal that I have negotiated does is provides that good security cooperation while protecting the jobs that depend on that trade relationship with the European Union. That is why, as I say, it isn't a deal that appeals to those who want there are many who want a relationship that is closer. There are those who want a relationship that is further apart. What I believe is important is that we respect the views of those who voted leave and deliver Brexit, but we also recognise that we do need to protect the trading relationship and ensure that we protect the jobs that rely on that trading relationship with the European Union for the future. I'll give way to my...
I'm very grateful for giving way. If Parliament does not support her deal, what would she say is the most likely outcome? No deal or no Brexit?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I'm going to come on to reference the problems if Parliament doesn't support this deal in a little later in my speech, if he will wait for that. I give way to the honourable lady.
Prime Minister for giving way and absolutely agree with her that we need to start coming together as a country once this process is over. But doesn't she also agree that if she is so convinced that her deal and political agreement are what the British people voted for, then she should have confidence to go back and ask them to verify if it is something that they support?
Prime Minister.
Can I say to the honourable lady that, as I have said in this chamber before, I think it is very important that all of us in this House recognise what this Parliament did. This Parliament overwhelmingly voted to give the choice of membership of the European Union to the British people. The people voted. They voted to leave. I believe it is incumbent on us to deliver that Brexit, and I believe it is a matter for trust in politicians and in this House that we do indeed deliver on that Brexit. I'll give way to my right honourable friend, then I'll give way.
Can I ask my right honourable friend, is the details within the deal that she has agreed will ensure that the inward investment that we've received in this country, which has led to many hundreds of thousands of jobs, particularly in the automotive industry, will have the same access to markets that they presently have?
Prime Minister.
Can I say to my right honourable friend, that is absolutely what underpinned the proposal we put forward in the summer. It is what underpins the ambitious trade relationship that is identified in the political declaration, ensuring that people can invest in this country with confidence. And reference was made earlier to people voting for a brighter future for this country. We can deliver that brighter future for this country with a deal that delivers a good relationship with Europe, but also enables us to have those other trade deals around the rest of the world as well. I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. She has courageously and consistently said that there will be no second referendum. Would she agree that a second referendum would reopen all the wounds within families, and above all, it would put the Union itself in jeopardy?
Prime Minister.
Can I say to my right honourable friend that I do indeed agree with him? I think a second referendum would exacerbate division in our country and would not bring our country back together again. Now, I will give way to the honourable lady, and then I will make some progress.
The Prime Minister for giving way. The Prime Minister has repeatedly referenced the 52% who voted to leave, but I'm still confused as to why she is not willing to take any cognizance of the fact that electoral law has been broken and therefore the result of the referendum cannot be trusted. Otherwise, we may as well abolish electoral law altogether. Will the Prime Minister not at least respond to the findings of the Electoral Commission?
Prime Minister.
The Electoral Commission still says that they believe that it was a fair poll, and I believe that we should abide by the result of that poll and deliver for the people of this country. Mr. Speaker, we can choose to settle this issue now. I've said I'll make some progress, and then I will be generous in my acceptance of interventions. Mr. Speaker, we can choose to settle this issue now by backing the deal in this motion, a deal that delivers Brexit and a new partnership with the European Union, a deal that delivers for the whole United Kingdom, a deal that begins to bring our country back together again. I'm
very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. The deal that she has brought back has my full and unequivocal support. But could I just ask her? Could I just ask her to confirm this? That as we leave, our country will still be a rules-based, international, outward-looking, caring and compassionate country that stands as a beacon for good in the world.
Minister.
I'm very happy to give my honourable friend that absolute reassurance, but more than that, we will be a country that promotes those values, that promotes that rules-based international order around the world. That is what we have always done as a UK, and it is what we will continue to do. take two more further interventions. I'll take the right honourable gentleman.
Grateful to the Prime Minister. On the 30th of March, under the agreement, the UK will lose its place on the EU Data Protection Board, even though ministers have said they wanted to hang on to that place. It's a place where the UK has wielded considerable influence on the development of European policy. Isn't the reality about the agreement that we will continue to have to obey these rules, but we will have lost the ability to influence what those rules are?
The position in terms of voting rights and various elements once we've left the European Union, of course, is going to change. But what has been clear from the agreements that we've negotiated is the capacity for the United Kingdom to continue to give some technical support where that is appropriate in a whole range of matters. On a number of the issues which are dealt with by the European Union in terms of the rules that they operate, of course, these are not just European Union rules, they are international standards on which the United Kingdom will continue during the implementation period and beyond to have its role. I said I would take a second. I've got my honourable friend.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. It is unfortunate for government to be in contempt of Parliament. Would she agree that it is worse for Parliament to be in contempt of the British people, which is what will happen if we do not deliver on Brexit? Thank you.
Well,
Prime Minister.
Can I say to my honourable friend, I absolutely agree that it is the duty, I believe, of this Parliament, it is the duty of us as politicians to deliver on the result of the vote that the British people gave in 2016 in the referendum. They voted, we gave them the choice, they voted to leave the EU. It is up to us to deliver that leaving of the European Union in the interests of our country. Mr. Speaker, I will make some progress. Mr. Speaker, the decision we have before us has two elements to it. The withdrawal agreement that sets out the terms of our departure from the European Union, and the political declaration that sets the terms of our future relationship. If I may, I would just make a little progress. Sets the terms of our future relationship with the EU. The withdrawal agreement ensures that we leave the European Union on the 29th of March next year in a smooth and orderly way. It protects the rights of EU citizens living in the UK and UK citizens living in the EU so they can carry on living their lives as before. It delivers a time-limited implementation period to give business time to prepare for the new arrangements. And during the implementation period, trade will continue on current terms, so businesses only have to face one set of changes. And it ensures a fair settlement of our financial obligations, less than half of what some originally expected and demanded. I will give way to my...
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way and apologise for intervening in that manner. 2 years ago, I said to the Prime Minister that I could never imagine her requesting me to vote to take away the rights of my Italian parents resident in Scotland. Can she confirm that her deal guarantees the rights of EU nationals in the United Kingdom, 3.6 million of them, as well as 1 million United Kingdom citizens in the EU 27 in a way that no deal would not?
Prime Minister.
Can I say to my honourable friend, this withdrawal agreement does indeed guarantee those citizens' rights, the rights of UK citizens in the EU and the rights of EU citizens here in the United Kingdom. And that guarantee of those rights is delivered through this withdrawal agreement. I'll take my honourable friend and then I will make some more progress.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. No one can doubt her commitment to this deal and the passion with which she is selling it. She has twice referred in the early part of her statement to the status of Northern Ireland and that this is a good deal for Northern Ireland. I come from Northern Ireland, I'm a Catholic and a Unionist, I understand it pretty well. Can she explain why it is that that passion that this is a good deal for Northern Ireland is not shared by those who understand Northern Ireland the best?
Prime Minister.
Well, my honourable friend raises a point. I recognise there are those representatives who sit from Northern Ireland in this Westminster Parliament who are concerned by aspects of the deal that has been agreed. There are elements of that where it is within the responsibility of this Parliament and this Government to be able to provide some reassurance about those elements that have raised concern, and it is a matter I will wish to continue to discuss with the representatives from Northern Ireland. And I give way to the honourable lady.
Thank you. I'm very grateful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful indeed to the Prime Minister for letting me intervene on her. May I just say that while the DUP have 10 MPs in this House, the DUP campaigned for leave. The majority of people in Northern Ireland, like me, campaigned for remain. So the DUP do not speak for the majority of people I can reassure the Prime Minister that her withdrawal agreement has considerable support in Northern Ireland, particularly amongst farmers, businesses and fishermen. I'm sorry that people feel this is funny. It's not. It's really serious for the people of Northern Ireland. The issue that needs reassurance from the Prime Minister is the constitutional guarantee of the Good Friday Agreement, which the Labour Party should be proud of, which is guaranteed in the Withdrawal Agreement and also in the political declaration. Why the Labour Party choose to vote against it beats me, but would the Prime Minister please give a constitutional assurance to the people of Northern Ireland that nothing in this deal threatens the consent principle or the constitutional status as guaranteed in the Belfast Agreement.
Can I say to the honourable lady, I am very happy to give that absolute assurance to her. This is an issue that we have kept through from the... It was referenced in the December joint report, it's in the withdrawal agreement, it's clear in the political declaration. Nothing we will do in this relationship, in this deal that we're determining with the European Union will affect that position. We will continue to uphold the Belfast Agreement. I give way to the Leader of the DUP.
Very grateful to the Prime Minister. And of course, the referendum that was held was a referendum of the whole United Kingdom. Yes. And as a unionist, I respect the referendum result across the United Kingdom. Manchester, London, Scotland, other places voted differently. Whatever way they voted, the result is that the United Kingdom voted and that we should respect that. Can I ask the Prime Minister, obviously in terms of the views of Northern Ireland, I'm quite happy to put it to a test any time. We will happily go to the electorate and put our views to the people if needs be, and I'm quite certain that we would be returned in greater numbers than we are today. So I'm quite happy to take on the challenge that has been put down. But can I ask the Prime Minister, in terms of guaranteeing Northern Ireland's position, she will remember that in paragraph 50 of the joint report that we spent 4 days negotiating, there were guarantees given to Northern Ireland. Never mind the words that have been said in this House today. It was actually in the text. Why has that been deleted? Why has she not kept that in the withdrawal agreement? Why has it not been translated? And that is what we have a problem with. Words are good. It's the legal text, it's what's in the agreement that matters.
I say to the right honourable gentleman that he's absolutely right, of course, that there was that reference to the consent of the Northern Ireland institutions in relation to any potential new regulatory differences between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That is a matter that we will be looking at and can look at in this House as to the arrangements, the parliamentary arrangements between the institutions within the United Kingdom for the future. And is it exactly these issues of the question of potential new regulatory divergence that is the one that I believe it will be possible to give the reassurance to not just representatives in this chamber, but actually to the people of Northern Ireland for their future. Now, I am going to make some more progress in this debate, but I will continue to take interventions, but I will make some more progress now. Mr. Speaker, the withdrawal agreement also ensures a fair settlement of our financial obligations, as I said, but I do want to turn to the most contentious element of the withdrawal agreement. Perhaps it was a neat segue, my last intervention being from the right honourable gentleman, because I want to turn to the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's important to remember, I think, what is at the heart of the protocol. It is our commitment to the people of Northern Ireland. It's about saying that whatever happens as we leave the European Union, as I have just said to the honourable lady, we will honour the Belfast Agreement. That the hard-won peace that has inspired the world and the detailed arrangements that have delivered and sustained it will not be lost. That the people of Northern Ireland and Ireland will be able to carry on living their lives as before. And to deliver that, We need a solution in the future partnership which ensures there's no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Both the UK and the EU are fully committed to having our future relationship in place by the 1st of January 2021. But there is still the possibility that it is not ready before the end of the implementation period. So the only way to absolutely guarantee no hard border on the island of Ireland at the end of the implementation period is to have a backstop in the withdrawal agreement as a last resort insurance policy. Let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, this is true not just for the deal we have negotiated. Whether you want a model like Canada's or whether you want to see the UK as a member of the European Economic Area, any future relationship will need to be negotiated and will need an insurance policy if that negotiation cannot be completed in time. Put simply, there is no possible withdrawal agreement without a legally operative backstop. No backstop means no deal.
The Prime Minister is well aware that many of us have wished her well in these negotiations, but does she understand and recognise that many of us also have concerns about the backstop and equate it to entering a contract of employment which gives the sole right of termination to the other party?
Minister.
If my honourable friend will permit me, I recognise the concerns that there are in this House, and I want to go on to reference those. I'm going to go on to reference those a little later. If my honourable friend will just...
Can I just very gently exhort the Prime Minister to face the House, because in answering her honourable friend can hear very well, but members on the other side can't. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I understand that some colleagues are worried, as I've just said, that we could end up stuck in this backstop indefinitely. In the negotiations, we secured 7 separate commitments in the withdrawal agreement and political declaration to ensure that this is not the case. First, there is an explicit legal duty to use best endeavours to reach an agreement by the end of December 2020 that avoids the backstop coming into force in the first place. This is not just a political commitment. As the Attorney-General has set out, this is a recognised approach in international law, and we have the right to seek independent arbitration if this duty is not upheld. Second, if despite this the future relationship is not ready in time, the backstop can be replaced by alternative arrangements. The political declaration makes clear that we will seek to draw upon all available facilitations and technologies that could be used to avoid a hard border, and preparatory work will be done before we leave so we can make rapid progress after our withdrawal. Third, if neither the future relationship nor the alternative arrangements were ready by the end of 2020, we would not have to go into the backstop at this point. Instead, we've negotiated there would be a clear choice between the backstop or a short extension to the implementation period. Fourth, if we do not go into the backstop, the legal text is explicit that it should be temporary and that the Article 50 legal base cannot provide for a permanent relationship. Fifth, if the backstop is no longer necessary to avoid a hard border, we have the right to trigger a review through the Joint Committee. Sixth, as a result of the changes we've negotiated, there is an explicit termination clause which allows the backstop to be turned off. And finally, the legal text is now clear that once the backstop has been superseded, it will cease to apply. So if a future Parliament decided to move from an initially deep trade relationship to a looser one, the backstop could not return. But rather, I will give way to one.
I'm most grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way, and she's indeed being very generous in giving way to a lot of people. Mr. Speaker, what I would say is that as far as the backstop is concerned, we are told that the EU do not wish to exercise it. Ireland does not wish to exercise it, and certainly the United Kingdom does not wish to exercise it. Is it therefore not a case that this is not a matter of renegotiating the withdrawal agreement, but actually a matter of the European Union showing goodwill and good faith towards the United Kingdom by allowing us one additional line in the withdrawal agreement? Words to the effect that, in the event of the backstop being triggered, the United Kingdom can, say, at 3 months' notice, leave the customs union. To allow that one line would show enormous good faith and goodwill on the part of the EU and nothing else.
Prime Minister.
Can I say to my honourable friend, I recognise the degree of concern that there is about this issue. I'm going to want to speak about it in my speech further. The withdrawal agreement has been negotiated. It is clear from the European Union that this is the deal. And I just ask those colleagues who wish to reopen the withdrawal agreement to recognise that were the withdrawal agreement to be reopened, it would not simply be a question of what the United Kingdom then wanted to change. It would also be a question of enabling others to change elements of that withdrawal agreement. And given the rigorous fight that we had in the negotiations to ensure that there were certain elements that were in the interests of the United Kingdom, notably around fisheries and other issues too, I caution honourable members that not only does the EU make clear that the withdrawal agreement cannot be opened, and we have agreed the deal, and the deal is there, but it is not the one-way street that perhaps honourable members would wish it to be. But I will come on to reference the wider issue. If I could finish this point, maybe it might respond to some of the comments, because I think rather than focus on the legal mechanisms, we now have to avoid the backstop and ensure that if it's used, it's only temporary. I think the real question the House needs to ask itself is whether it's in the EU's interest for the backstop to be used, and if it is used, for it to endure. And their original proposal for the backstop would have split the UK into 2 customs territories and given only Northern Ireland tariff-free access to their market. It barely changed their orthodoxy. It was wholly unacceptable to us. But the backstop we've succeeded in negotiating no longer splits the UK into 2 customs territories. It gives the whole UK tariff-free access to their market without free movement of people, without any financial contribution, without having to follow most of the level playing field rules, and without allowing them any access to our waters. So the backstop is not a trick to trap us in the EU. It actually gives us some important benefits of access to the EU's market without many of the obligations. And that is something the EU will want to let happen, let alone persist for a long time. But I do know, and I recognise, and as has been clear from the contributions that have been made by honourable friends, that there are members of this House who remain concerned. I have listened to those concerns. I want us to consider how we could go further, and I will be continuing to meet colleagues to find an acceptable solution.
Grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. As she confronts the inevitable contradictions at the heart of this process on behalf of the nation, is it not worth remembering that the vast majority of members, including on the benches opposite, voted to trigger Article 50 and voted for the referendum in the first place? And could I remind her that out amongst the country, her commitment to trying to pursue this is hugely admired. Given that this issue divides all parties in this House, indeed on this side it even divides the factions, would it not be sensible next week, as Parliament begins to take back control, to consider a free vote?
Prime Minister.
Can I say to my honourable friend, first of all, I think it is important that all honourable members of this House remember not only that this House overwhelmingly gave the decision on whether or not to leave the European Union to the people in the referendum. That was an overwhelming vote of this House. That this House also voted by a significant majority to trigger Article 50, to continue that process of leaving the European Union. And as I said in my remarks earlier, the fact that at the general election last year, I think about 80% of the vote went to parties who had in their manifesto a solid commitment to deliver on the Brexit vote. And I think we should all remember that when it comes to voting in the motion next week. Mr. Speaker, I will give way to my honourable friend who's been trying valiantly for some time, and then I will make some progress.
Very grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. Yesterday we tried to ask the Attorney General for his legal advice as to how much of the £39 billion that we were going to hand over were we legally, contractually obliged to do so. He refused to give us a specific figure. Would the Prime Minister now give that specific figure? Because when we're going to be handing over £39 billion to the European Union when we're facing shortages in our own constituencies.
Can I say to my honourable friend, there are different there are different elements to the 39 billion in terms of the liabilities that they refer to. Of course, 20 billion, roughly 20 billion of that sum of money is in relation to the payments that will be made during the implementation period, which is actually about ensuring that we have the smooth and orderly exit that is good for businesses. There are other, obviously, liabilities within that, which where it is determined that we have legal obligations. But as I say, that part of the money, and it's 34 to 39 billion. Everybody quotes the higher figure, but it's 34 to 39 billion within that range that the final figure will come. Mr. Speaker, and I say to honourable members that I recognise we have 5 days of debate, but actually I think honourable members will want to contribute in today's debate as well, so I will make some progress. But the second part of this deal is the political declaration. Now, this is a detailed set of instructions to negotiators that will be used to deliver a legal agreement on an ambitious future relationship for after we have left. And I know that there are some members who worry that the political declaration is not already legally binding. It cannot be a legal agreement at this stage because the EU cannot legally agree a future relationship with us until we are a non-member state. But through the negotiations, we have ensured that we have the framework for an ambitious new economic and security partnership that is absolutely in our national interest. At the outset, the EU said we would have a binary choice, Norway or Canada. The political declaration concedes that there is a spectrum and we will have an unprecedented economic relationship that no other major economy has. The EU also said we couldn't share security capabilities as a non-member state outside of free movement and outside of the Schengen area. But we have secured the broadest security partnership in the EU's history. So if this deal is passed, I will give way in a few minutes, I'll just make the progress on this point. If this deal is passed, the task ahead of us will be to turn this ambitious political declaration into our new legal agreement with the EU. I will give way to the honourable lady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Prime Minister for giving way. But I must intervene at this point because she claims that this political declaration is detailed and specific. But if that was the case, why would the Treasury Select Committee told today that it wasn't even possible to produce an analysis from an economic perspective of this document because it simply wasn't specific enough?
The economic analysis that was produced by the government last week was very clear that because the political declaration has within it a spectrum where the balance of obligations in relation to the rights of access, balance of obligations on checks at the border in relation to market access has to be addressed. It's very clear that that's going to be ambitious, and we will continue to work for frictionless trade, which is indeed what was put forward in the White Paper in the summer. But it was only right and proper that in the government's economic analysis we indicated a midpoint on that spectrum, which gave an indication to people of the impact of trade barriers should trade barriers be put up. I give way to the right honourable lady.
Prime Minister for giving way. She is being very generous. But does she not understand that by overclaiming what is in the political declaration, she is undermining trust, and she is asking for our trust in her and in the EU to determine what will happen in future because so little is resolved. Yeah. So not only on the spectrum on the economics, but also on the security issues she is overclaiming. She suggested to my honourable friend that she had effectively secured agreement to SIS2. She knows she has not because she tried to get it. Paragraph 87 does not say SIS2. Instead, what it simply refers to is the parties will consider the arrangements, and if we are lucky, we will get something that approximates. That is not the same as SIS2, and she knows it. Will she be straight with the country and with Parliament about the political declaration?
I've said this to honourable and right honourable members before, and I will say it again. That there is a difference between ensuring that we have the capabilities that we need in security in the future and simply saying that we will be in a particular way, doing that in a particular way. What paragraph 87 makes clear is the intent to have exchange of information on wanted or missing persons and objects and of criminal records with a view to delivering capabilities, that is, insofar as it is technically and legally possible and considered necessary and in both parties' interests, approximate those enabled by relevant union mechanisms. I have said, no, I'm sorry. This is a fundamental issue which has underpinned the approach to these negotiations. We could have approached these negotiations by saying we are going to take the models that already exist, and we in all cases are going to say that we have to be in those models in exactly the same way as we are today. What we have said is that we look to ensure that we can have the capabilities that we have where we need those capabilities, and that is exactly what we are delivering in. No, I'm sorry to the Right Honourable Lady, and that is exactly what we have got in this political declaration. So, I will give way to the Right Honourable Lady on that point, and then I will make further progress.
To the Prime Minister, but she knows she tried to get the exact same thing. She tried to get SIS2. Be honest with the House. She should say that she tried to get SIS2 and she failed. She got PRUM, she got other ones. Like, ask her to tell us whether she tried to get SIS2.
I'm sure that the Right Honourable Lady will want to be clear that she's not suggesting that the Prime Minister has been other than honest. She's presumably encouraging forthrightness, is she?
I certainly am encouraging forthrightness, and I would not challenge the Prime Minister's integrity because I know she has worked immensely hard on this. But I am asking her to give accurate information to the House. Did she try to get SIS2 rather than pretending that she was trying to get parallel capabilities?
Prime Minister.
We are clear that the capabilities that are currently available to us as a member of SIS2 and as a member within ECRIS are what those capabilities are. It is still open to us to look to have the same relationship in relation to SIS2 and ECRIS as we have at the current time. But we want to ensure that it is the capabilities that underpin SIS2 and ECRIS that we do indeed. And I'm tempted to say to the Right Honourable Lady, she may like to cast her mind back to the time when I was Home Secretary and she was Shadow Home Secretary, when I was standing at this dispatch box moving the motion that ensured that we could rejoin 35 measures on justice and home affairs matters, including SIS2 and ECRIS, and she was working, I seem to recall, with my honourable friend, the member for North Somerset, to stop the government from rejoining those measures. So, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, if this deal is passed, the task ahead of us will be to turn this ambitious political declaration into our new legal agreement with the EU. I'm going to make more progress. In doing so, I think this next section may be of interest to members of this House. In doing so, I want to build the broadest possible consensus both within this House and across the country. So for the next stage of negotiations, we will ensure a greater and more formal role for Parliament. This will begin immediately as we develop our negotiating mandate, building on the political declaration ahead of the 29th of March 2019. The Government will consult more widely and engage more intensively with Parliament as we finalise the mandate for the next phase of the negotiations. Ministers will appear before select committees between now and March in each relevant area of the political declaration, from fisheries to space to foreign policy. So members across the House will be able to contribute their expertise to the detailed positions we take forward with the EU. And the whole House will be consulted on the final version of that full mandate. And we will also provide the devolved administrations with a similar degree of detailed engagement. We will undertake targeted engagement with business and civil society to help inform our detailed negotiating positions. Taken together, I'll give way to the Chairman of the Select Committee. Yes.
She's been extremely generous in giving way. She said a moment ago that the House of Commons would be consulted on the mandate. Exactly. Can she give the House a very simple assurance that the House of Commons will get to vote on whether to approve that mandate or not?
Can I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the outline of that mandate has already been set, will be set in the political declaration. That is the deal that has been agreed with the European Union. As I say, what we are looking for is to have the expertise of the House, the views of the House, when we go into that negotiating position. And as I've said, I realise to the Chairman of the Select Committee that I said ministers will appear before the Select Committee. Of course, ministers will have to be invited by the Select Committee to appear before them, but I hope that Select Committees will indeed accept that it is important for ministers to appear on these matters. Taken together, Taken together, these arrangements will support a national mission to forge the strongest possible future relationship with our European partners, commensurate with our wider global goals and in the interests of the whole country. Mr. Speaker, let me turn. No, I am going to. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the amendment proposed by the Leader of the Opposition. First, it argues for a permanent customs union. The benefits of a customs union is that it means no tariffs, fees, charges, quantitative restrictions or rules of origin checks. All of these are explicit in our deal, but importantly, it goes further, because it also gives us the crucial ability to have an independent trade policy beyond our partnership with the EU, which membership of the customs union would not. So the Leader of the Opposition needs to explain why he does not share our ambition for a global Britain. Second, the amendment argues for a strong single market deal. If that means being close to the single market but not part of it, then it is our deal which delivers the closest possible partnership. If it actually means being in the single market, then he is opposing taking back control of our borders and ending free movement. And that not only contravenes the democratic instruction of the British people, it contravenes his own manifesto. Third, the amendment claims our deal would, quote, lead to increased barriers to trade in goods and services. Unless his policy is to stay in the single market as well as a customs union, then some increase in barriers is inevitable. But it is our deal that is the best deal outside the single market and which gives us the opportunities that come from an independent trade policy and increased regulatory freedom. We are now at the stage in this process.
I'm very grateful. As the UK will have lost the ability to influence EU rulemaking on financial services directly, it's vital that we can play a full part in defending our interests in international bodies that set standards globally, such as the Basel Committee and IOSCO and others. Does she therefore share my concern that Article 129 of the draft treaty, which clearly states that the EU may not take a contrary position to the EU in such bodies, will prevent us from doing so?
I think Article 129 that I'm looking at in this matter actually is about the joint committee responsible for the management, administration and supervision of the dispute resolution in the future. So, yes, that's... Oh, well, he's... But I say to the honourable gentleman, no. We have been very clear in the area of financial services. We've been very clear in the area of financial services that it is important, because of the significance of financial services to the United Kingdom, that we are able to ensure that we have that ability to set those regulations that we need to set as a global financial centre, working with the other bodies in terms of the regulatory, other regulatory bodies, and doing that in the interest not just of the United Kingdom, but in the interest of financial stability across the world. We are now at the stage, Mr. Speaker, in this process we must all engage with the hard choices we face. Simply pretending everything can stay the same as we leave the EU, as Labour's amendment does not face up to these hard choices and amounts to not being straight with the people of this country. Fourth, the amendment claims our deal would not protect workers' rights and environmental standards. This is simply wrong. Our deal does protect them. As part of the single customs territory in the Northern Ireland Protocol, we've committed to ensuring there will be no reduction in standards in this area, including on labour and social protection, fundamental rights at work, occupational health and safety, and fair working conditions. And we have said we will improve on this in developing our future relationship with the EU. Indeed, we already go further than EU minimum standards, including on annual leave, paid maternity leave, flexible working, paternity leave and pay, and parental leave. For we know that the first responsibility for protecting those rights sits with this Parliament. And as we take back control of our laws, we will not only honour that responsibility, but go further still, including, for example, by implementing the recommendations of the Taylor Review. So not just protecting workers' rights, but enhancing workers' rights. Now, fifth, The amendment, fifth, the amendment claims our deal allows the diminution of our security. Now, the Leader of the Opposition knows full well that if we fulfil the democratic decision of the British people to leave the EU, we cannot have exactly the same rights as a third country that we currently have as a member. So the question is, which deal represents the broadest security partnership in the EU's history? And that is our deal. But what is he doing it? He is opposing it. 6, his amendment appears to reject the backstop, even though businesses, farmers and people from across the community in Northern Ireland, as we heard earlier, support this insurance policy. And I think there is real anger in Northern Ireland at the approach that Labour are taking. Finally, the amendment opposes leaving without a deal. But the EU has been crystal clear that no backstop means no deal. So his amendment is simultaneously opposing no deal and proposing a policy that would lead to exactly that. So I have to say that at this critical moment in our history, the Leader of the Opposition is not making a serious proposition for the future of this country. He is simply trying to force a general election. And the Right Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington has admitted it when he said, and I quote, "Our view is we should have a general election." At a time when we should be delivering on the vote of the British people, the Leader of the Opposition wants to ignore that and have another vote. At a time when government is working in the national interest, the Leader of the Opposition is playing party politics. And at a time when we should all be focused at this historic moment on what is best for our country, the Leader of the Opposition is thinking about what gives him the best chance of forcing a general election. Mr. Speaker, let me now turn to the amendment from the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central. This also seeks to reject our deal as well as to reject no deal. But this House cannot unilaterally rule out no deal. The only way to avoid no deal is to agree a deal, and that requires the agreement of this House and the European Union. And I have been very generous with my interventions. I will take some further interventions in a few minutes, but I will make this point. If you reject what the other side have described as the only deal on offer, then whatever you say to the contrary, you put this country on course for no deal. And this is doubly so. This is doubly so. This is doubly so when the amendment is silent on what alternative deal we should strike. The EU 27 member states have made it clear that this is the best deal available and that there is neither the time nor the inclination to reopen negotiations and ensure we leave in good order on the 29th of March next year. The choice before Parliament is clear. This deal, no deal, or the risk of no Brexit. And I will just a couple of minutes. And investing parliamentary time in seeking to create an alternative to these choices will only endanger our ability to deliver Brexit at all. I can wait to my honourable friend.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for giving way and congratulate her on 2 years of the trickiest negotiations in our lifetime. Some of my colleagues in this House seem to think that if they reject this deal on Tuesday, the other EU 27 leaders will come back and give us something better. Why should they?
I think my honourable friend raises a very important point. Exactly, and they certainly don't intend to do that. They have made very clear in relation to this deal that this is the deal on the table. I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank the Prime Minister. I welcome the Prime Minister's commitment to engage further with select committees. What she will have heard when she came to the liaison committee last week was one committee chair after the other pointing out to her the catastrophic consequences of no deal and asking if she would rule that out if and when this House rejects the deal, because we cannot inflict that kind of catastrophe on our people.
So to the honourable lady, the way to ensure, if she is concerned about no deal, the way to ensure there is no deal is to support the deal that is on the table. I will give way one more time to the honourable gentleman who's been trying several occasions.
I'm extremely grateful to the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this feels like the fall of the Ancien regime this afternoon. But can I take her back to what I think was meant to be? Can I take her... No, I think he was there. Can I take her back to the bit that I think was supposed to be the Scotland part of this speech on devolved administrations? What the Scottish Parliament will not be interested in is ministers making day trips for a number of hours to Scotland to come over with meaningless waffle. If we are to be convinced that their views will genuinely be taken into account, what will change, because they haven't been up until this point?
The Honourable Gentleman knows full well we have had a high degree of engagement with the Scottish Government and indeed with the Welsh Government on all of the matters as we have been going through. We will continue to have that high level of agreement, of engagement. There are areas where there is a disagreement. The Scottish Government wants to remain in, ideally, I think the Scottish Government wants to remain in the European Union. That would deny the vote of the British people. That would deny the vote of the British people. So we do have a difference of opinion on that. Let me now deal with another question that has been raised. Which is the question of another referendum. I understand the argument that if this House is deadlocked, we could give the decision back to the British people. But I ask the House to consider what that would say to those in our constituencies who put aside decades of doubt in the political process because they believed that their voice would finally be heard. What it would say about the state of our democracy if the biggest vote in our history were to be rerun because a majority in this House didn't like the outcome. And what it would do to that democracy and what forces it would unleash. This House voted to give the decision to the British people. This House promised we would honour their decision. If we betray that promise, how can we expect them to trust us again? And even if we held a referendum, what would it achieve? It wouldn't bring the country together, it would divide us all over again. It wouldn't end the debate, because if it was close like last time, then whichever side lost out would soon start to call for a third one. And it wouldn't take us forward, but rather back to square one. We cannot afford to spend the next decade as a country going round in circles on the question of our relationship with the European Union. We have already spent too many years with divisions on Europe simmering in the body politic. We must deliver on the referendum we have already had, focus on the day-to-day concerns of the people, and take this country forward.
I thank the Prime Minister so much for her generosity. Our youngest child has just gone to university, Prime Minister. Could she give assurances that when he comes out, he will walk into a world where he can make his way in this world and in this country? Could she give assurances that this government will have the ship back on track, that we will have respected the democratic view of this country, we will have trusted the people as we expect them to trust us, but we will also respect the European Union, we will have close relationships with that great trading bloc, but we will also be able to hold our head up on the global worldwide stage so that we will not be diminished, Prime Minister, we will be even greater.
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend. She may have anticipated what I'm just about to say in my speech. I can give her absolutely that assurance because I want to be clear what this deal delivers for the country. An end to free movement once and for all. An end to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in the United Kingdom. An end to those vast sums we send to Brussels every year. A fair settlement of our financial obligations, less than half. No. I am conscious that I have now been speaking and taking interventions for an hour. There are many members of this House who wish to contribute to this debate, and I will make progress. A new free trade area with no tariffs, fees, quantitative restrictions or rules of origin checks. An unprecedented economic relationship that no other major economy has. And at the same time, the freedom to have an independent trade policy and to strike new trade deals all around the world. This deal means being out of EU programmes that do not work for us. out of the common agriculture policy, out of the common fisheries policy as an independent coastal state once again with full control over our waters. It means jobs protected, citizens' rights protected, the integrity of our United Kingdom protected, the sovereignty of Gibraltar protected, our security protected, with the broadest security partnership in the EU's history, working together with our friends and neighbours to keep all our people safe. The British people want us to get on with a deal that honours the referendum and allows us to come together again as a country, whichever way we voted, and this is the deal that delivers for the British people. Mr. Speaker, no, I'm not taking. Mr. Speaker, I have spent nearly 2 years negotiating this deal. I have lost valued colleagues along the way. I'm concluding. I've faced fierce criticism from all sides. If I had banged the table, walked out of the room, and at the end of the process delivered the very same deal that is before us today, some might say that I'd done a better job. But I didn't play to the gallery. I focused on getting a deal that honours the referendum, sets us on course for a bright future, and I did so through painstaking hard work. Because I have never thought that politics was simply about broadcasting your own opinions on the matter at hand. It is as much about listening to people from all sides.
Order. Mr. McNeill, I'm very concerned. No, you were chuntering noisily from a sedentary position. I saw you and I heard you. And your apprenticeship to become a statesman has still a very substantial distance to travel. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, politics is as much about listening to people from all sides of the debate and then doing what you believe is in our national interest. And that's what I've done. And sticking to the task has delivered results for the British people. When the EU gave us a choice between off-the-shelf models, I've won a bespoke deal. When in Salzburg the EU tried to insist on a backstop that carved out Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK, I faced them down and they backed down. And right at the end, when Spain tried to make a move on Gibraltar, I stood firm and protected Gibraltar's sovereignty. And that is why the Chief Minister of Gibraltar has said, no friend of Gibraltar should vote this deal down. And don't let anyone here think that there's a better deal to be won by shouting louder. Don't imagine that if we vote this down, a different deal is going to miraculously appear. The alternative is uncertainty and risk. The risk that Brexit could be stopped. The risk we could crash out with no deal. And the only certainty would be uncertainty. Bad for our economy and bad for our standing in the world. And that is not in the national interest. The alternative is for this House to lead our country forward into a brighter future. I don't say that this deal is perfect. It was never going to be. That's the nature of a negotiation. Yes, it is a compromise. It speaks to the hopes and desires of our fellow citizens who voted to leave and those who voted to stay in. And we will not bring our country together if we seek a relationship that gives everything to one side of the argument and nothing to the other. We should not let the search for the perfect Brexit prevent a good Brexit that delivers for the British people. And we should not contemplate a course that fails to respect the result of the referendum, because it would decimate the trust of millions of people in our politics for a generation. And to all sides of, to all sides of the debate, to every member in every party, I say that this deal deserves your support for what it achieves for all of our people and our whole United Kingdom. One union of 4 nations, now and in the future. And this is a debate about our future. It's not about whether we could have taken a different road in the past, but which road we should take from here. If we put aside our differences and remember what unites us, if we broker an honourable compromise in the interest not of ourselves, but of those we were sent here to serve, if we come together and do our duty to our constituents, then we will pass the test that history has set for us today. It's not easy when the passions run so deep, but looking around this chamber, I know we can meet this moment. So I promise you today, this is the very best deal for the British people. I ask you to back it in the best interests of our constituents and our country. And with my whole heart, I commend this motion to the House.
The question is order. The question is motion number 4, as on the order paper. I call the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This is a seminal debate in the history of this House and for the future of our country. I've been in the House since 1983, and this debate and this decision we'll take next week is one of the most important we will ever take whilst we're members of this House. The deal before us would make our country worse off. Taken together with the Withdrawal Agreement and the future partnership, they present a huge and damaging failure for Britain. The Prime Minister says this is a good deal and is so confident of that that she attempted to refuse to publish the government's legal advice. She was forced to publish it by votes in this House today. However, the economic assessments and other assessments which we will see indicate that this is actually a bad deal. These documents are the product of 2 years of botched negotiations in which the government spent more time arguing with itself than it did in negotiating with the European Union. It's not only on Brexit where they failed. The economy is weak. Investment is poor. Wage growth is weak. Our public services are in crisis, and local councils are collapsing because of this government's refusal to fund them properly. More people in this country are living in poverty, including 500,000 more children since 2010. The government should be ashamed of themselves for that. Poverty is rising, homelessness is rising, household debt is rising too. Mr Speaker, it's against this backdrop that this government has produced this botched deal that even breaches the Prime Minister's own red lines. Across this House, it's achieved something. It's united both Conservative Remainers and Conservative Leavers and members of every opposition party in an extraordinary coalition against the deal. Mr Speaker, Mr Speaker, Mr Speaker, it could have all been so different. It could have all been so different following the 2017 election. The Prime Minister...
Order, calm yourselves. Some of these antics are rather undesirable and to be deprecated. They may have a role on the playing fields at some public school, I don't know, but they have no role in this chamber. No, they're just unseemly and inappropriate. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr Speaker, it could have all been so different following the 2017 general election.
I'm going to say it once, but I'll say it as many times as necessary, and colleagues who want to speak will be prevented from doing so by that sort of pathetic self-indulgence. The right honourable gentleman will give way when he wants to give way. If you don't like it, frankly, you can lump it. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It could have all been so different. Following the 2017 election, the Prime Minister could have attempted to build a consensus, recognising the new arithmetic of Parliament, and sought a deal that brought people together. Instead, just like her predecessor, who called a referendum without preparing for the eventuality of a Leave vote, the Prime Minister has seen these negotiations only as an exercise in the internal management of the Conservative Party, and that did not work out very well at all. When the two previous Brexit secretaries, who theoretically at least led the negotiations, well, they did theoretically, say they cannot support the deal, how can she expect anyone else in this House or in this country to have faith in a deal that's been rejected by two of the people that were involved in the negotiation of it? Mr Speaker, No deal, Mr. Speaker, no deal is not a real option. Mr. Speaker, no deal is not a real option, and the government knows that because it is not seriously prepared for it. 11 out of the 12 critical infrastructure projects, 12 critical infrastructure projects that would need to be in place by the end of March 2019 to manage a no-deal Brexit are at risk of not being completed on time, according to the National Audit Office.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for having the courage to give way to somebody on this side when he refused to give way to the former Shadow Chancellor 3 times running. Why could he explain to the House why he has not got the courage to debate my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, on Sunday?
I'm quite happy to debate the Prime Minister. I noticed she wasn't very keen to debate with anybody during the general election, but that's in the. But we understand that. Mr. Speaker, the government has been forced to publish its full legal advice, voted for by this House. I hope and assume that advice will be published tomorrow, because members ought to be in possession of all of the facts. In 2007, the Prime Minister then argued, and I absolutely agreed with her, that the full legal advice should have been made available before the Iraq War. I agreed with her then. Why did she push it right to the wire here and lose 2 votes in the House in order to try and prevent the legal advice being published that's so necessary to inform us in our debates? This withdrawal agreement is, Mr. Speaker, a leap in the dark. It takes us no closer to understanding what the future of our country post-Brexit would look like. And neither does the future partnership, which I will come on to. The Prime Minister states that the transition period ends in December 2020. Article 132 actually says it can be extended for up to 2 years to the 31st December 2022.
That Brexit is painted as dividing our nation, but it's actually united our party in opposition to the Prime Minister's proposals, and it's united many people on that side. 2 former Brexit secretaries, the former Foreign Secretary, and 2 former Science and Higher Education ministers. I actually wanted to ask the Prime Minister who the new Science and Higher Education Minister is. She didn't take my intervention. Perhaps batting for that sector is incompatible with her Brexit and indeed any form of Brexit.
Just before we proceed, can I just very gently say to the House that intervention should be brief, not mini speeches. The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my friend for the intervention. The Labour Party discussed the issue at great length at party conference, agreed we would oppose this deal, and said that if the government can't govern and can't command a majority of the House, then the great British tradition is those governments resign and you have a general election.
I thank my right honourable. Why don't you just take him? I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Will my right honourable friend agree that this Santa Claus letter of a deal offers no protection for workers' rights, for jobs, for the environment, for frictionless trade? Vote it down.
Mr. Speaker, my friend is right, because what this deal doesn't do is ensure that if there are changes across the EU in improvement of workers' rights and conditions, they're necessarily mirrored in this country. And when the Prime Minister talks so grandly about workers' rights in this country, what comes to my mind is 1 million people on 0 hours contracts. What comes to my mind is people trying to make ends meet by doing 2 or 3 jobs just to feed their children. The Prime Minister states that the transition period ends, as I said, in 2020. Article 132 actually says this can be extended for up to 2 years to December 2022. The Business Secretary is already clear it's likely to be extended to that period, and under this bad deal, we'd have to pay whatever the EU demands to extend it for those 2 years. Under this deal, under this deal, in December 2020, we will be faced with a choice, Mr. Speaker. Either pay more and extend the transition period, or fall into the backstop. At that point, Britain would be over a barrel. We would have left the EU, have no UK rebate, and be forced to pay whatever was demanded. Alternatively, Article 185, the Northern Ireland Protocol, the backstop, would apply. Not only would that mean Northern Ireland would be subject to significantly different regulations than the rest of the UK, but the EU has a right of veto over the UK's exit from the backstop arrangement. Far from taking back control, this is actually handing control to somebody else, which is what the Prime Minister is asking us to support today. Whether in a backstop or an extended transition, the UK would have no say over the rules. We could, by that time, have already given up our seat on the Council of Ministers, our Commissioner and our MEPs, without having negotiated any alternative say in our future. This government is not taking back control, it is losing control. No wonder.
In terms of control, the one item that is in control of all of us is which way we vote on Tuesday. The Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition has said he does not want no deal. The EU leaders have made it clear it is this deal or no deal. Does he realise that it will be his vote that pushes us into no deal? Because that is what it is asking us to vote for.
Mr. Angus Brendan McNeill.
Speaker, I distinctly heard Donald Tusk at the weekend saying the options are no Brexit, no deal or this deal. So to say it's a binary choice is not right.
I'm extraordinarily grateful for the honourable gentleman's elucidation, but that intervention suffers from one notable disadvantage, and that is that it wasn't even tangential to being a point of order. The honourable gentleman's intervention and points of order are not even nodding acquaintances in my experience. Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, it really is not credible for the government to come to this House with this deal that does damage a great deal of our economic interests, that does reduce our powers to decide our relationships in the future, does damage our trade, and then say there's no alternative. This House will make its decision next Tuesday. I hope and expect this House will reject that deal. At that point, the government has lost the confidence of the House. I think they should reflect on that. Either they've got to get a better deal from the EU or give way to those who will. And no wonder the Science Minister, the member for East Surrey, resigned, saying this deal will cost us, and I quote, our voice, our vote and our veto.
The opposition.
Chris, come over here.
If he's so emphatic that we won't have a no-deal exit if we reject the Prime Minister's deal, what deal does he suggest we're going to put in place between now and March of next year, which will avoid that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the House rejects this deal, as I hope it will, it's then up to the government to go back and negotiate something like a new comprehensive customs union, which would be backed by both the TUC and the CBI, which is necessary to defend jobs and also have access to a strong single market. We cannot be told this is the only thing we can do. The process of negotiation is to be accountable. The government is going to be held to account. I hope this deal is rejected, in which case we will force the government to go back and negotiate. The last 2 years, Mr. Speaker, the last 2 years. Oh, all right, yes, okay.
I want to hear the intervention. A lot of noise. Mr. Christopher Leslie.
Very grateful, actually, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to agree with my honourable friend that I agree this is a bad deal. Doesn't he agree that our country would be better off remaining in the European Union than exiting on the basis of this deal?
Mr. Speaker, the referendum took place. We fought the election respecting the result of the referendum. We are opposed to this deal. We think there is the possibility of getting an agreement which would be better for this country and give us the control which is not given by this government's proposals to us. The last 2 years gives us no confidence that the government can do a deal in under 2 years, taking us up to the transition period. So at some point before December 2020, the focus would then inevitably shift from negotiations on the future relationship to negotiations on an extension of the transition period, including negotiating what further payments we would have to make to the EU. So, Mr. Speaker, we are over a barrel, either paying whatever is demanded or negotiating away fishing rights or who knows what else. This is a terrible failure of negotiation by this government. Should the backstop come into force?
I thank the right honourable friend for giving way. Would you agree that the Prime Minister will not take her political declarations for this deal to the people because she is afraid that her Brexit ship would sink?
Well, we will know the outcome of that next Tuesday when the vote takes place in this House, but any analysis of this deal would show it's unacceptable and should be defeated in this House. Should the backstop come into force, there is no time limit or end point. It locks Britain into a deal from which it cannot leave. Remember that, it cannot leave without the agreement of the EU.
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable giving way. I wonder if he could, following his answer to his Right Honourable friend, could he now clarify? He says that the Labour Party stood on a manifesto that accepted the result of the referendum, and he was clear on that. And yet since then we know the member for Hayes and Harlington has suggested that the Labour Party's position would now be to support a second referendum. Will you now clarify, for the sake of the House, is the Labour Party's position to support a second referendum, or is it that they accept the result of the first referendum and will not support a second referendum?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the member for Chingford has read the Labour manifesto with great caution and detail. Oh, he did. We were quite clear that we respected the result of the referendum, and in our conference motion we discussed the whole issue at great length, and our party agreed at the largest Labour Party conference ever held in our party's history unanimously to back the composite motion that we put forward, which did oppose this process which the government is putting forward, and suggests that if the government can't govern, and it looks increasingly like it can't, then they should make way and have an election. That is our priority. Should the backstop come into force, there is no time limit or end point. It locks Britain into a deal from which it cannot leave, as I said. This is, I believe, the first time ever, as was said yesterday in questions to the Attorney-General, the first time ever in the history of this country that we've signed up to a treaty that we could not leave out of our own volition. That is quite a serious indictment of this government. And in the backstop, restrictions on state aid are hardwired with an arbitration mechanism. But no such guarantee exists for workers' rights. New state aid rules could be brought in whether they were in Britain's interest or not. The Attorney General made that very, very clear yesterday.
Order, just order. You'd have a bickering between members of the same party as to whom the Leader of the Opposition is giving way to. I think it is the honourable gentleman from Anhelian and Yar who's been invited to intervene. But just before he does, order, I should just remind colleagues, that it is legitimate to use mobile devices without impairing decorum. But it has just been brought to my attention there is a very widespread use of them, and I would just gently remind colleagues that they most certainly should not be taking photographs in the chamber. Yeah, no, I know exactly what I'm doing and what I'm saying and upon what advice. It requires no comment or contradiction, simply a recognition of the validity of the point. Mr. Angus Brendan McNeill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the honourable gentleman for giving way as well. The honourable gentleman talks about respecting the referendum. Fair enough, that's his point of view. I've got a different respect in Scotland. But the question I want to ask him is, will he respect the mandate that the Scottish Government has and the Scottish Parliament's will to have a second independence referendum? How far does his respect go?
Well, it's not actually relevant to this debate today, Mr. Speaker. We are talking about the deal that the government has brought back, and that's what the debate is about. In the backstop of the regulatory frameworks dealt with by non-regression clauses are non-enforceable by EU institutions or by arbitration arrangements, and will give the government the power to tear up workers' rights, damage environmental protections and consumer safeguards.
Will he give way on that point? Isn't one of the most extraordinary things about the debate so far that we've not had a single mention of the word immigration? And yet it was meant to be one of the most important aspects of the referendum. The government hasn't even published an immigration bill. We don't know what our immigration policy will be next year. And don't we really want to stand up for the rights of young British people to be able to study, work, live elsewhere in the European Union? Because it's British people who've used it more than any other country in Europe.
I'm coming to that in my speech, but I just say absolutely. Young people need that right to travel, need that right to be able to study, and I think the Erasmus scheme has actually worked very well, giving opportunities for a lot of people to study. And I'll come on to this again, but I just think we should reflect on the massive work done by European Union nationals who've come to make their homes in this country and helped us developed our health service and many other services. The backstop would apply separate regulatory rules to Northern Ireland. This is despite the fact that the Prime Minister said this is something, and I quote, no UK Prime Minister could ever agree to. Another of her red lines breached. In fact, the list of the EU measures that continue to apply to Northern Ireland runs to 75 pages of the agreement.
Would my right honourable friend agree with me that this is a bad deal? And one of the reasons for that is the Prime Minister has spent much of the 2.5 years discussing the deal with her colleagues on the Conservative Party rather than negotiating with the European Union.
My friend is so right. This has been a negotiation with the Cabinet, it's been a negotiation with Conservative MPs, it's been a negotiation within the Conservative Party. That's where all the concentration has been. And indeed, one of the Brexit secretaries hardly ever went to Brussels anyway, presumably being more interested in arguments within the Conservative Party. It's also clear that the Prime Minister's red line regarding the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice has been torn up. Under the Prime Minister's plan, by 2022, we will either be in a backstop or still in transition, where we will continue to contribute to the European Union budget and follow the rules overseen by the European Court of Justice. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary said on the 25th of November only that the deal largely ends the jurisdiction of the ECJ. It is crystal clear that the Prime Minister's claim that this plan means we take control over our laws, money and borders is utterly far-fetched. On the future partnership, Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. There isn't a deal. There's a framework for a future partnership. Our trading relationship with Europe is still to be negotiated, and it will take years to do that. We still don't know what our long-term relationship with Europe would look like, and that's why so many MPs across Parliament are not willing to vote for this blindfold Brexit and take a leap in the dark about Britain's future. There is no mention of the Prime Minister's favoured term implementation period anywhere in the 600 pages of the Withdrawal Agreement. And no wonder. There is precious little new to implement spelt out either in the agreement or in the future partnership. The agreement does call for a transition period, but there is nothing to transition to. It's a bridge to nowhere. As the 26-page document says, it can lead to a spectrum of different outcomes, as well as checks and controls. And we're expected to endorse that as a basis of our future relationship with the European Union. After 2 years of negotiations, all the government has really agreed to is a very vague wish list. And, Mr. Speaker, only three of its 26 pages deal with trade. It's not a trade deal. It's not even close to a trade deal. The trade deal recently signed between the EU and Canada took 7 years to negotiate and ran to 1,600 pages. In 2.5 years, this government has agreed to 3 pages of text on trade. It's hardly an encouraging start to the future trade relationships. The former Brexit Secretary committed to, and I quote, detailed, precise and substantive document. We had the right to expect one. What we got contains no mention of frictionless trade, promised at Chequers, or even trade as frictionless as possible, promised before that. There is no ambition to negotiate a new comprehensive customs union with a British say that would protect jobs, trade and industry, and so uncertainty continues for business.
Does my right honourable friend agree with me? Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this deal does not deliver frictionless trade, and that this would have a negative impact on the economy and risk jobs as well?
No, it certainly doesn't deliver frictionless trade, and those working in industry are extremely worried about what's going to be happening in the future because they don't see this deal as protecting their jobs or their future. The demand for a new comprehensive customs union is one that has united both the CBI and the TUC because it protects manufacturing supply chains. The decision to rule out a customs union and the lack of clarity in the deal risks business investment being deferred on an even greater scale than it is at the moment, costing jobs and living standards. And many companies may decide the lack of certainty means they will explore their contingency plans to relocate elsewhere. Both the First Ministers of Wales and of Scotland have also made clear to the Prime Minister that they would support participation in a customs union to protect the economy and jobs. A commitment to a new and comprehensive customs union could, I believe, have found support in this House. The government didn't seek it.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for giving way. The Leader of the Opposition talks about uncertainty, but I put to him just one example as to why I would encourage him to support the Prime Minister's deal, and it's this. If that deal does not go through, we could face a situation at 11:01 p.m. on the 29th of March where 1 million UK citizens living in the EU 27 will no longer have their rights guaranteed. what would he do in that position?
I would imagine the honourable member supports the Prime Minister's deal because he is incredibly loyal to his party, with a blindness about the dangers of this deal to the rest of the country and the jobs that go with it. The lack of clarity around these proposals also means there is no guarantee of a strong deal with the single market to ensure continued access to European markets in services, merely a vague commitment to go beyond the baseline of the World Trade Organization. As both the Attorney General and the Environment Secretary have made clear in recent days, the commitments to workers' rights, environmental protections and consumer safeguards are very, very far from secure. Mr. Speaker, the social Europe that many people supported and continue to support was not part of why people voted to leave. All of that is at risk from this deal. This deal fails to give so many economic sectors and public services clarity about our future relationships with several European Union agencies and programmes. Take, for example, the Galileo programme. Caroline.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. On the environment, would he agree with me that the Prime Minister's deal seriously undermines environmental protection in this country because it does not replace the European Court of Justice with anything like the strength of an enforcement body? Instead of the promised watchdog, we've got much less than just a lapdog.
The member is absolutely correct, because the environmental protections that we have are obviously essential. You cannot protect the environment inside national borders. It has to be done across national borders, and we have to have the toughest possible environmental protection regulations. The suspicion that many of us have is that there's an appetite on that side of the House to remove many of these protections as time goes on.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. On the point of environmental protections and other protections, which is so important, does he agree with me that the government's obsession on clamping down on foreign aid, state aid, is something that is the wrong focus, and they should be focusing on all of the protections that we're bringing up right at this moment in time?
Mr. Speaker, the state aid rules of the European Union are something this government has been very, very happy to sign up to, and indeed used that as a means of not defending the steelworks at Redcar when they could have done something about it and defended those jobs in Redcar at that time. It's the failure of this government to do anything to protect those steelworks and those jobs that they should be condemned for. And I thank my friend for his intervention and the work that he did to try and protect those jobs. Take, for example, Mr. Speaker, the Galileo programme, to which the UK has so far contributed £1.2 billion. But now we seem set to walk away from it. Then there is a lack of clarity about whether we will continue to participate in the European Arrest Warrant, Europol or Eurojust. The Chequers proposal argued for the UK maintaining membership of the European Aviation Safety Agency and the European Medicines Agency, but the future partnership merely allows for cooperation.
I thank the right honourable member for giving way. Thank you, Chair. Does my right honourable friend agree that while the Prime Minister seems proud to claim freedom of movement has ended, she can't tell us what it will be replaced with? Is it not right that we see the government's immigration white paper before the meaningful vote?
I'm coming on to that in just 1 second. We lack similar clarity about many others, including Horizon 2020, Erasmus, mentioned by my friend, which have been so brilliant in providing students with opportunities to study in other countries. That is why so many young people are so concerned at this present time about what is happening. And Mr. Speaker, there is no clarity about any future immigration system between the UK and the European Union. And it now seems the immigration white paper we were promised in December 2017 won't even appear in December 2018. Following the disgraceful Windrush scandal, many prospective migrants will have no confidence in the ability of this government to deliver a fair and efficient system.
Thank you. Thank you, my right honourable friend, for giving way. And thank you for mentioning immigration. Immigration is a serious thing that our young people are concerned about, and especially to do with Brexit. But because you've mentioned the Windrush scandal, do you agree that lessons learned is not good enough? We need a public inquiry to really understand the Windrush scandal and the hostile environment. And when we get this, we will understand more about how the government is committed to immigration and getting things right, especially at times like this.
I thank my friend for her intervention, and as the daughter of a Windrush generation migrant to this country, she fully understands how horrible it felt in her community when this Prime Minister, as Home Secretary, deliberately created the hostile environment which was so damaging to community relations all across our country. And many EU nationals already here have no faith in this government to manage the process of settled status fairly or efficiently. These are people who've contributed to our country, to our economy, to our public services, and especially our NHS. We all meet them in hospitals and doctor surgery. It's these people who are now so anxious about their future. Mr. Speaker, to our negotiating partners in the European Union, I say this. We understand why, after 2 years of negotiations, you want this resolved. But this Parliament represents the people of this country, and the deal negotiated by this government is not good enough for the people of this country. So if Parliament votes down the deal, then reopening negotiations cannot and should not be ruled out. There is a deal that I believe can win the support of this House and bring the country together, based on a new comprehensive and permanent customs union with a UK say, and real protection of workers' rights and environmental and consumer safeguards. Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, I've been very generous, Mr. Speaker, in giving way, particularly to that side. As I conclude, Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, I want to pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, a shadow Brexit secretary, and his team of shadow ministers. He's now facing his third Brexit secretary. He's stayed the course, holding this government to account. And I thank him and his wonderful team and their supporters for what they've done, and the success today in forcing the government to release the legal advice they were trying to withhold from us. This is not the deal the country was promised, and Parliament cannot, and I believe will not, accept it. The false choice between this bad deal and no deal will also be rejected. People around the country...
Leader of the Opposition is not currently giving way. He's developing his point. He's developing his point. Members don't need to set themselves up as though they're conducting an orchestra. It is not necessary. Mr. Hoare, for example, you're an incorrigible individual. Your assistance in this matter is not required. I'm afraid you're a veteran of Oxford Union badinage, and you've never really overcome it, I think. Jeremy Corbyn.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, this is not the deal the country was promised, and Parliament cannot, and I believe will not, accept it. The false choice between this bad deal and no deal will also be rejected. People around this country are very anxious. Businesses and workers are anxious about the industries they work in, the jobs they hold, and about the stability of this country. I've given way a great many times, and I'm going to draw my remarks to a close very soon. The responsibility, Mr. Speaker, for this state of anxiety lies solely with this government. 2 years of botched negotiations have led us here today. Members of this House have a very important decision 1 week today. To vote for this deal would be to damage our economy, to make our constituents poorer, and to take a leap in the dark for the future of this country. Don't take my word for it. The government published its own economic assessment, which found the Chequers proposals would make our economy nearly 4% smaller than it would otherwise be, thus knocking 100 billion out of our economy within 15 years. For those who like to break down these sorts of figures into weekly amounts, that's nearly 2 billion a week less. And that definitely was not seen on the side of a bus. Mr. Speaker, Labour will vote against this deal. A bad deal for Britain, a bad deal for our economy, and, I believe, a bad deal for our democracy. Our country deserves better than this.
Mr. Boris Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is perfectly clear from listening to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Labour Party, that he is joining with his Shadow Chancellor and his Shadow Brexit Secretary, and now determined to frustrate Brexit and the result of the referendum in 2016. It's absolutely clear from what he said just now. But I must regretfully say to my Right Honourable friend, the Prime Minister, I really can't believe that there is a single member of this House who sincerely believes that this deal we have before us is a good deal for the UK.
There are a lot.
And if I may say, you can tell, there we go, there's one. There's one. He's been here. There's one. And I must say, I said sincerely. I said sincerely. And you can tell that the government's heart...
Order. Forgive me. Point of order, Mr. Edward Vasey.
I sincerely believe it. I've got no stake in this government anymore, but I still think it's the right thing to do.
Mr. Boris Johnson.
In which case, I'm happy to acknowledge the sincerity of my honourable friend, but I have to say that I think the government's heart does not appear to be in this deal, and I think listening to those who are sent out to defend it and to explain it, they know that it is a democratic disaster. In fact, after 2 years of negotiation, as has already been said, I think it has achieved an extraordinary thing in the sense that it has brought us together, finally. It has brought us together in the sense Remainers and Leavers, myself, Tony Blair, we are united. The whole Johnson family is united in the belief that this is I'm afraid, a national humiliation that makes a mockery of Brexit. And I'm sorry to say this, these are hard truths, but there will be no proper free trade deals as a result of this deal. We will not take back control of our laws. And for the government to continue to suggest otherwise is to do violence to the natural meaning of words. We will give up £39 billion for nothing. We will not be taking back control of our borders, Mr. Speaker. Not only have we yet to settle the terms on which the EU migrants will in future come to this country, but we will be levying EU tariffs at UK ports and sending 80% of the cash to Brussels. In short, we are going to be rules takers. We are going to be a de facto colony. And out of sheer funk, I'm sorry to have to say this to the House, we are ensuring that we will never, ever be able to take advantage of the freedoms that we should have won by Brexit. And under the terms of the backstop, we have to stay in the customs union while Northern Ireland, and therefore the rest of the UK, if we want to keep the union together, will stay in regulatory alignment unless and until the EU decides to let us go. And why should they let us go? By handing over £39 billion, we lose all our leverage in the talks. With a £95 billion surplus that they have with us in goods alone, the EU has absolutely no interest or incentive to allow us. I will happily give way.
I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way. The Prime Minister gave us 7 reasons why the EU will not be using this backstop. The Attorney General yesterday made it completely clear that the backstop, if it ever came to place, would be challengeable under EU law itself. I say to my greatly respected colleague that I think he is promoting Project Fear, because what is his option?
Order, resume your seat. I'm sorry to have to bark at the Honourable Lady, but the intervention is just too long. End of. No, enough. Boris Johnson.
A very good point, nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, because it's exactly on the point. Because as I've been saying, the EU has no incentive whatever to let us out of this backstop, precisely because they have this massive trade surplus with us. And furthermore, they have, when they look at UK manufacturing and UK business, they realise that they will have, in that backstop and through the whole of the implementation period and beyond, unchecked and unmediated power, effectively to legislate for the UK, with no UK representation. And if the Honourable General Opposite thinks that's an ideal situation for this country to end up in, then let him speak now.
The Right Honourable Member talks about an ideal situation. The Right Honourable Member was a senior member of Vote Leave. He was Foreign Secretary for 2 years. We are in this mess because of him. Does he take no responsibility?
No. I do not. I'm grateful to the honourable member, but the fact is that I'm afraid I was not able to continue to support this process for precisely that reason. They know if a House will allow me, I will just make some progress. They know that having that regulatory control over us, they would have no incentive, as it were, to take the foot off our neck. And they will have us in permanent captivity as a memento mori, as a reminder to the world of what happens to all those who try to leave the EU. And this is a recipe for blackmail, and it is open to any member of the EU to name its price. If my honourable friend will allow me, I'll just make some progress. To name its price for Britain's right to leave the backstop. The Spanish will make a play for Gibraltar, the French will go for our fish and for our bankers, the Germans may well want some concessions on the free movement of EU nationals, and so it goes on. I'll give away in just a second. The worst of it is that we have not even tried properly to leave. And the worst, or shown any real interest in having a different future. And I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. The Prime Minister at the dispatch box today was generous. She made very clear that for us to unify the country, we have to bring the 48% that voted to stay as well as the 52. Can I ask my right honourable friend, someone that was regarded in London as a unifying political figure, what would he do to bring the 48 and the 52 together?
I think that as I say, Remain and Leave have been to a very large extent united in their dismay at what I think is a wholly undemocratic deal. And the thing that really pains me, and the gentleman opposite asked about the role of ministers in this. And I have to say that we on the UK side of the negotiation, I think, have been responsible for forging our own manacles, in the sense that it's almost as though we've decided that we needed to stay in the customs union and in the single market in defiance of the wishes of the people. And we should be careful about... I'll give way to my honourable friend behind me who's been chuntering away from a sedentary position from behind. I'll give way in a minute. We should be careful about claiming any kind of subterfuge. But it is very hard to understand how... We've lost 2 Brexit secretaries in the course of these negotiations. It's very hard to understand how the former Secretary of State for the Department for leaving the EU could have been kept in the dark about the crucial addition to paragraph 23 of the political declaration, my honourable friend, where this country agreed, in paragraph 23, apparently without the knowledge of the elected politician concerned, that our future relationship would be based on the backstop. No one campaigned for that outcome. No one campaigned, no one voted for this type of Brexit. This isn't Brexit. This is not Brexit, but a feeble simulacrum of national independence. It is a. I'll give way in a second to this gentleman here. It is a paint and plaster pseudo Brexit. And beneath the camouflage, we find the same old EU institutions as the customs union and the single market, and all of it adjudicated, by the way, by the European Court of Justice. If we vote for this deal, we will not be taking back control, but losing control.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. He appears to be one of those who prefers the grievance to the solution. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has come up with a solution. What's his big idea?
I was coming to that, Mr. Speaker. You anticipate.
Order! Members must not shout across the chamber at the right honourable gentleman. It's extremely unseemly. Order! I've no doubt that the right honourable gentleman is well able to look after himself. I'm not really concerned about him. I'm concerned about the reputation of the House. Boris Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, well, I've been told by your leave that I have an unlimited time to speak, so I will come to the solution that my honourable friend craves in just a minute, because the solution is, in fact, I'll just make some progress. If we vote for this deal, we are not taking back control. Indeed, I would say to colleagues, friends across the House of Commons, I would say that we are part of a representative democracy, and voting for this deal would be not just, as it were, turkeys voting for Christmas. It's actually worse than that. There is a sense in which, of course, we would be voting for Turkey. Or Turkish, as my right honourable friend. That's exactly true. That is exactly true. We'd be voting for Turkey in the sense, or Turkish-style membership of the customs union, obliged to watch as access to the UK market is traded by Brussels, but with no say in the negotiations. And of course, the kicker is that with its veto, the EU ensures that the backstop they impose on us is more subservient even than the arrangements that the Turks have. And it's a wonder, frankly, that's absolutely true, it's a wonder that any democratic politician could conceivably vote for this deal. And yet I know, one second, and yet I know that many good colleagues are indeed determined to do so, in the belief that we have no alternative or that we've run out of road, and, as we've heard earlier on, that Brussels will offer us nothing else. And I want respectfully to deal with those anxieties, which I'm sure my honourable friend shares.
Very grateful. Given that my right honourable friend appears to be unwilling to enter into an understanding of what negotiation is, can we take it from that my right honourable friend has actually only ever meant that no deal is a good deal, because he does not believe in having a deal with an institution which he is philosophically opposed to, and windmills that he tilts at every turn?
I may say with great respect and admiration to my honourable friend, I do not philosophically oppose the European Union. I simply think that membership of the European Union for the purposes of the UK is no longer right. And that was what I campaigned on, and I think it was, and I think the British people were completely right. And as for no deal, no, I don't believe that no deal is the option that we should be going for automatically. But I will come to that in just a minute. I want to deal with these anxieties, and I know that my honourable friend shares, because I do think that he is profoundly mistaken, as indeed are all colleagues, in thinking that we have absolutely no option but to go ahead on this basis. We have plenty of other options. And I think in order to see the way ahead, we need to understand what happens on Tuesday, next Tuesday, if, as I very much hope, this great House of Commons votes down this deal. And I'll tell you what happens. And you've got to put yourself in the mind of our counterparts across the table in Brussels, because I tell you, in Brussels, they think they've got us beat. They do. They think that our nerve will eventually fail. They think that the Prime Minister will come to the summit next week, and in the event of this deal being voted down, and ask for some cosmetic changes. And I expect that they will think about granting some cosmetic language that is intended to be helpful, but which does not change the legal position. And I think in Brussels they are confident that sometime before March next year the government will come back to this House, and they think that this deal will go through somehow or other, by hook or by crook. Because as everybody keeps saying, there is allegedly no alternative, and the Norway option will be seen for what it is, an even worse solution than what is currently proposed. The notion of extending Article 50, delaying the date of Brexit, would be greeted, I think, with fury by the electorate, as indeed would any attempt to amend the terms of exit so as to plunge us back into the customs union. That would be rumbled by the electorate as well. So I will give way with pleasure to my honourable friend.
Thank you very much, my honourable friend. Is he not concerned that trying to win 7-0, he may lose 4-3?
No, I understand exactly the analogy that he speaks of, but I've heard it said by defenders of the government that we may be 1-0 down at the end of this first half of the negotiation, but that we're going to win 2-0 or 2-1 by the end. And I have to say that I don't see it that way. If we go on like this with the backstop in the way that it is, I believe that we will be thrashed out of sight. And I have to say that I will come to Carol in a minute. I think I've already given way to you. Mr. Speaker, I will come to Carol in a minute. Having studied the UK negotiating style in detail, I don't think that they believe we...
Order. There is excessive noise in the chamber. My understanding, insofar as I can hear, is... Order! Calm yourself. Is that Mr. Johnson is not currently giving way. Boris Johnson.
Given way, I think the House will agree quite a lot so far. And I'm very happy to give way in the future. But I just want to come to the point that has been raised by honourable friends around this. Just one second. They think that we've got nothing left in our tank, and they think that we want to do a deal at any price. And I think that now is the time, as we all think about this vote and what we are individually going to do, now is the time, thinking about the attitude in Brussels towards us, for us to show that they grossly underestimate this country and this House of Commons and our attachment to our liberties, because there is an alternative and there is another way. And we should not pretend after 2 years of wasted negotiations that it is going to be easy. But it is the only option that delivers on the will of the people, but I believe also maintains our democratic self-respect as a country. And that is to say, what is obvious from this debate and from every poll that I have seen, we should go back to Brussels. We should go back to Brussels, and we should say to them, yes, we want a deal if we can get one. And yes, there is much in the withdrawal agreement that we can keep, notably the good work that has been done on citizens. Notably the good work that is done on citizens. And a gentleman opposite, comment from a sedentary position, he compares the European Union to Lavrov and Russia. I have to say, I think that's an entirely inapposite comparison. These are our friends. These are our partners. To compare them, I think, to Russia today is quite extraordinary. And we should say that we appreciate the good work that is done, that has been done to protect the rights of citizens on either side of the Channel. But we must be clear
Give way to the chairman of the
we must be clear that we will not accept the backstop. Because it is nonsensical to claim that this backstop is somehow essential for further progress in the negotiations. And the question of the Irish border is for the future partnership and not the withdrawal agreement. It was always absurd that it should be imported into this section of the negotiations. And we should use the implementation period to negotiate that future partnership, as I believe the government itself envisages. And by the way, we should withhold at least half of that £39 billion until the negotiation is concluded, the negotiation on the new partnership. And I think if we did that, I hope that answers your question.
Is that a big idea?
I think it's certainly better than your idea. I believe the EU will sense. I will give way the pleasure.
The right honourable gentleman for giving way. It's a simple question. Is the deal that's currently on the table better or worse than staying in the European Union?
I'm afraid it's a finely balanced question, and much will depend. Much will depend on what happens. Much will depend on what happens after the vote on Tuesday. And I believe that if we say what I propose, the EU will understand that the government has found its resolve and is willing to be tough at last, and I believe the EU will do a deal on those terms. But in case they aren't, and I think I'm going to anticipate my right honourable friend's question. I bet I know what he's going to say. In case they do not agree, we must be absolutely emphatic now that we are preparing urgently for the possibility that we will indeed have to leave before we reach a final agreement. And yes, I'll give way. If that wasn't.
I mean, what we're voting on is a withdrawal agreement on 3 points that have to be settled before the big, wide, grown-up negotiations start on the future relationship, on a very wide agenda over the next few years. What he is suggesting is we reject this withdrawal agreement now, in December, before we march leave. We go back and say we're not going to pay our contribution to any legal liabilities and any continued access, and we're not at this stage going to guarantee an open border in Ireland. Does he think there's the faintest chance of that being listened to seriously by any other member government? And isn't he just dooming us, if he gets his way, to rush to a catastrophic no deal?
I must say I don't agree with that at all. I think obviously we should state, which is agreed amongst all, that there will be no hard border in Northern Ireland. All sides agree to that. As for the legal liabilities to pay the £39 billion, those are, to say the least, contested. And I believe that it is additionally vital. It is additionally vital to do what we've failed to do so far, and that's to show that we have the conviction and the willingness to leave without an agreement. And yes, I agree that will mean a great national effort if it comes to that point. And yes, it will mean that we have to make sure that we can get all the goods to our ports in addition to Dover, and we'll have to ensure that the planes can fly and to address all those other questions. And by the way, I will come to all of that.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for finally giving way, and he's presenting an illusion of the EU not being good for the UK. I would just ask him, does he also think Euratom is not good for the UK? And if so, can he explain to those currently waiting for cancer diagnosis and treatment where they're going to get their radioactive sources from?
I'm glad to have given way, because I really think that that's the kind of scaremongering about the consequences of leaving the EU that really does no favours, I must say respectfully, to the debate. And I think that the Treasury will have an opportunity to ensure that this is in the event of no deal, in the event of coming out without an agreement. The Treasury will have the opportunity to use that £39 billion to ensure that we can support the economy rather than talking it down. And I believe it will be far better. It would be far better to make that effort now and at least be responsible for our destiny than to agree to give up our right to self-government forever, because that's effectively what we were doing, just because of our lack of short-term competence or confidence. And quite right, just 1 second. Quite frankly, the EU will not treat us as a sovereign equal in these negotiations unless and until we are willing to stand up for our own interests now and in the future. And I tell you, Mr. Speaker, I think our country is ready for us to take this stand. I think they are, because I think they've had enough of being told that we can't do it, that the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world is not strong enough to run itself. And if we fail now, Mr. Speaker, it won't be good enough. I've given away a great deal. I've given away a great deal. I've given away a great deal. It won't be good enough to say to the our fishermen, that we can't actually take back control of our fish because in the end it all proved to be too difficult. And it won't be good enough to say to the people of Northern Ireland that after all those promises, after all those promises, we accept that they must be treated differently from the rest of the UK. And I will give way to that.
Very grateful. He talks about the avoidance of a hard border in Northern Ireland. Speaking to the DUP conference at the weekend, he said that if Great Britain chose to vary regulations, there'd be need for regulatory checks and customs borders between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Does he accept then, in some future world where the United Kingdom can vary its regulations as a whole, that would inevitably lead to regulatory checks between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland?
It is certainly, as Michel Barnier, I'm very glad that my honourable friend has raised that point, because it's a very, very important point. And Michel Barnier has himself said that these technical solutions to implement such regulatory checks, not necessarily customs checks, but regulatory checks away from the frontier can be found. And that is what we should be doing. And frankly, that is what we should have been doing for the last 2 years. That is where our effort and our energy should have gone. And on that point of regulation, it won't be good enough. It won't be good enough to tell the people of Northern Ireland they're now going to be treated differently. It won't be good enough to tell the business people of the UK, that now and in the future, they are going to be burdened. They are going to be burdened with regulation emanating from Brussels over which we will have absolutely no control, and we couldn't stop it because we couldn't see an alternative. And I must say to colleagues that if colleagues think that it is too disruptive to go now for the Super Canada option, if colleagues think it is going to be too disruptive to go for freedom now, just you wait until you feel the popular reaction that will follow when people realise that the referendum has been betrayed. And the tragedy, I'll give way with pleasure to my right honourable friend.
Honourable friend for giving way. Could he tell us how his cunning plan, which ends up with no deal, will secure the 485,000 jobs that rely on the automotive sector and the just-in-time supply chains, which he first heard about 6 months ago from the Secretary of State for Business and Industrial Strategy?
I won't comment on when I heard about just-in-time supply chains. It was many, many years ago. But the objective, as she knows, is to create a zero-tariff, zero-quota deal with the EU, which is readily deliverable when you consider that we already have zero tariffs and zero quotas. And as for her anxiety about job losses, I have to say that we've already heard a lot of prophecies about losses of jobs. I think it was said that we were going to lose 500,000 jobs in this country if the British people had the temerity to vote leave. Actually, we gained 800,000 jobs. So I take these prophecies, I'm afraid, with a pinch of salt. And the sad thing is The sad thing is that the sad thing is that too many people, indeed some of the people who've been negotiating this deal, seem to regard Brexit as a disaster to be managed rather than an opportunity. And I'm afraid they also see bad news. They see bad news as a vindication of that judgment and actually talk up bad news as a result. And in taking that attitude, I'm afraid they are badly misunderstanding the instincts of the people of this country, who didn't vote for Brexit out of hate. They didn't vote for Brexit out of hate, as I think the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff tweeted after the referendum. But they voted to take back control of our laws because they believe, and I think rightly, that if we govern ourselves and if we legislate in the interests of the UK economy, then they have a better chance. They have a better chance of good jobs and higher wages and cheaper food and clothes and a brighter future, all of which are possible under a proper Brexit, and none of which can be delivered by this deal. And above all, if we vote through this apology for Brexit, we will be showing that we have treated the 17.4 million people, the highest number of people ever to vote for a single proposition, with contempt. With contempt. We will be turning our backs on those people. And this country must understand that when the people of this country voted to leave in 2016, they voted for change. They did not vote for an endless transition or a thinly disguised version of the status quo. They voted for freedom, and they voted for independence, and they voted for a better Britain, and for a country where politicians actually listen to what the people say. And I may say to the House that if we try to cheat them now, as I fear that we are trying to cheat them, they will spot it and they will never forgive us.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is difficult to be here today. It is in many respects a debate that many of us wish was not happening. It is a real sorrow that I rise to respond to the government's motion. Mr. Speaker, the reality of Brexit is now laid before us. Broken promises of taking back control from a government that is so out of control. 21 ministerial resignations, communities, countries, households divided, our politics stale, a Prime Minister fighting for her political life. Mr. Speaker, the past number of months have been filled with political drama, theatre, squabbles and chaos. From crisis to crisis, this government hangs on by a thread. But beneath all of this is the real reality, the hard, cold truth that this is a moment of self-harm in our history. History has a way of teaching us lessons, if only we would listen. At a moment such as this, I reflect on someone that we regard as an icon. Winnie Ewing, Madam McCoss, who came into this House 51 years ago for the seat of Hamilton, represented the Highlands and Islands at the European Parliament and fought hard to make sure that Scotland benefited from its membership of the European Parliament, something I can see right throughout my constituency with all the signs of projects that were funded by European money. And we had a welcome year in the European Parliament, and indeed Winnie played such an important part in the development of that institution. We've heard of the importance of Erasmus today, and it holds a special place in the SNP's heart because it was Winnie Ewing who chaired the European Parliament's European and Culture Committee on Erasmus when it was established in the 1980s. That's the legacy of someone that fought hard to make sure that all of us benefited from that European membership. And if I can contrast the approach that we've had from Europe with this place, and I want to quote from the great lady herself, time after time, on matters great and small, we are still standing on the sidelines, mutely accepting what is decided elsewhere, instead of raising our voices and making our own choices.
Hear, hear.
Scotland's much vaunted partnership of Jonah and the whale. Mr. Speaker, respect for human dignity, human rights, freedom, democracy, equality and the rule of law. These are the core values of the European Union. Values that have united, not divided us as citizens of Europe now for many years. Values that are now ingrained in our society to be cherished and protected, not discarded or eroded. I am proud and privileged to be a citizen of the European Union. Mr. Speaker, the European Union has been the greatest peace project in our lifetime. A peace project born out of the horrors of 2 world wars that ripped Europe apart. A project that has gone on to change the course of our communities and improve citizens' rights and opportunities across the continent, not just now. A project that I still believe is worth defending, and we will, on these benches, defend that. A project that has enabled our generations to travel, to work, to live and to thrive across all countries that are within the European Union. Mr. Speaker, today I come here with a heavy heart, with the deepest regret that the opportunities that I had to work in Amsterdam, but also to travel throughout Europe in my working career, to learn from the best and the brightest across Europe, will be taken from our children. Because that's what we're doing. Embracing the diversity of European culture has enriched so many of us.
Absolutely.
The exciting opportunities to live and work in Amsterdam or Barcelona or Brussels or Berlin or Copenhagen or Vienna or so many other places. So many choices and opportunities that our generation had to work and to develop friendships across Europe. Mr. Speaker, to learn from the rich diversity that Europe has to offer, to benefit from the experiences of different cultures, to form friendships with those like us who celebrated being European citizens with shared rights. The right to live and work across the EU is to be ended as a right for the next generation. Mr. Speaker, I have in the gallery today an ex-colleague from Amsterdam when I worked for a bakery ingredients company, someone whose friendship was formed out of the opportunity that I had to work in Amsterdam. Our friendship is a celebration of the success of the opportunities the EU membership gave to all of us. That right to live and work together across the EU is to be ended as a right for the next generation. That automatic right to benefit for career opportunities to be removed. Opportunities to benefit from an inclusive Europe swapped for the constraints of an inward-looking United Kingdom. I'll give way to the...
I thank my right honourable friend giving way. Most people in this chamber know that my husband is German. What not all of them will know is that his mother was Polish and his parents were not allowed to marry. The child they had together was taken from them. His mother was a forced labourer and his father was lifted by the Gestapo. And long before we ended up in this mess, he used to celebrate that in one generation he could live and work where he wanted and marry who he loved. And in one more generation, we're taking it away. It's shameful.
I mean, I thank my honourable colleague and friend for that explanation of what we are doing. Colleagues, we must reflect on where we are, and I appeal to everyone throughout this House to stop and think about that erudite explanation of what has happened in Europe over the last 70 and 80 years. Stop and enshrine the benefits of free movement of people that has enriched so many of us. It is not too late to turn back. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I'm very proud to be the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament and celebrate the contribution that 1 million Poles have made to our country. But does he not share my concern that by offering or proposing another referendum, we could be giving wind to UKIP's sails, a party which is currently withering on the vine, which is falling apart? There will be a renaissance for UKIP if we have another referendum that overturns the previous result.
Ian Blackford. I must respectfully say to the honourable gentleman that we have to take this argument on. Migration has enriched us. Now, we come from the country of Scotland where our population has barely grown over the last 100 years, where we've gone from 4.8 to just over 5 million people. If we don't have access to free movement of people, we are not going to be able to deliver sustainable economic growth. And I say respectfully to the honourable gentleman that there are thousands of Poles who have come to work in Scotland over the course of the last few years. Let me say to all of them, to each and every one of them that may be watching tonight, you are welcome. You are welcome because of the contribution that you make to our life, to our culture, to our economy. And the thought that we would take up the drawbridge and stop people coming to participate in the growth of the future of our country is quite frankly repugnant to me. And I will fight with my colleagues to make sure that we remain an open society and we can continue to be enriched by those that want to come and live and make a contribution to our economy. They are welcome and they will remain welcome. Let me make some progress and then I will make a give way. Mr. Speaker, in April 1988, when the single market campaign began, one prominent speaker stated, "A single market without barriers, visible or invisible, giving you direct and unhindered access to the purchasing power of over 300 million of the world's wealthiest and most prosperous people. We are putting the European community to work for ordinary people, for cheaper airfares, for more and better services, for consumer choice and product safety." Mr. Speaker, that was Margaret Thatcher. Even Margaret Thatcher recognised that shared markets, collaboration and partnership in Europe was in all our interests. Many may be puzzled why I begin by expressing the sentiment and not directly the content of the government's motion. I do so because it's right.
Hear, hear.
It is right to remember the real loss that all of us will feel, and it's not simply the loss in this deal or any other. It's the fact that any deal will mean a loss to our economy, to our society and our children. We in the SNP have long argued and continue to believe that staying in the European Union is the best option for Scotland and indeed for all parts of the United Kingdom. And when I hear the Prime Minister say the choice if we vote down this deal or no deal is staying in the European Union, I say yes, please. Because fundamentally, there is no option that is going to be better for our economy, for jobs and for our communities than staying in the European Union.
That's a fact.
And it's the height of irresponsibility of any government to bring forward a proposition that's going to make its people poorer. A proposition that's going to mean that people are going to lose their jobs. And we heard earlier from the previous Foreign Secretary that it was Project Fear about jobs. But let's look at the reality. Let's look at what we already know. 1,000 jobs lost from the European Banking Authority. 1,000 jobs lost from the European Medicines Agency. Mr. Speaker, that's not Project Fear, that's the reality, and it's already happened.
Hear, hear, hear.
I will give way.
Can I commend the open nature of the speeches given, in stark contrast to the capricious and solipsistic nonsense from the former Foreign Secretary. But will he join me on the issue of EU nationals in calling on the government, even at this late stage, to drop the charge they intend to impose on EU nationals to keep rights that they already enjoy in this country right now? The cost of a passport might not be much to them, but it should be dropped as an act of goodwill.
Of course, my honourable friend is correct, and we simply should not be charging people to exercise the rights that they should have to be here. And I'll go further, because of course we're discussing rejecting this deal, but we're also ruling out no deal. But the government should make it absolutely crystal clear, in any scenario, that the rights of all our EU citizens here will be protected. But you know, there's another factor when we discuss the rights of EU citizens here, but also UK citizens in Europe. That UK citizens that are currently in Europe
will only have rights to stay and live and work in that one territory. The rights that they have had up until now of living, of travelling and working throughout the European Union are to be ended. What a disgrace. And many of these European citizens, I know of people that live in Belgium but work throughout the European continent, are going to have those rights countermanded. That, Mr. Speaker, is a disgrace. Let me make some progress and I will move on. Mr. Speaker, whilst we respect that England and Wales voted to leave the European Union, we ask that the government respect that Scotland did not. However, it is clear that the UK government has no intention of respecting the will of the Scottish people, as the deal that we are asked to support will do nothing to bring harm and hardship socially, economically and politically to Scotland. And, Mr. Speaker, we must remember that this fight, this huge struggle and burden on our society that now faces us from Brexit, comes from the Tory party and the Tory party alone. The European debate was an internal battle for the Tories, and they drove it into the public discourse, into a bigger battlefield, not because of the interests of the citizens of this country, but because of the deep divisions and narrow interests within the Tory party itself, not outside of it. We know today that it does not have to be so. We know that the Prime Minister's deal will be voted down. We know it, she knows it. This House should also vote to remove no deal from the table. There is no scenario where we will be wealthier with Brexit. No government should expose its citizens to economic risk. That is what will happen with Brexit. The government's own analysis shows that to be the case. Mr. Speaker, we must stop this madness. We can go back to the people of these islands and be honest with them on the consequences of Brexit. Today, the Advocate General Manuel Campos Sanchez Bordona has advised that EU law would allow the UK to unilaterally revoke Article 50.
Until the 29th of March.
We can hit the reset button. That, Prime Minister, is called leadership.
On that point, will he give way?
I'll give way.
I thank him for giving way. He touched on this point earlier, but does he agree with me that actually perhaps the people who are most affected by this are UK citizens who live in the EU, where it will require 27 countries in 27 different ways to address their concerns and their issues, who are perhaps most vulnerable in what the government are seeking to impose on us?
I fully agree, and I touched on that earlier, and it just shows how this Brexit deal is a complete shambles, and we need to think again. Mr. Speaker, a future in which Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England continues to flourish side by side as equal partners. As equal partners. These words are not mine. These are the words of the Prime Minister. A Prime Minister who promised us equal partners, but her rhetoric is in ruins, as her government's record has shown time and time again. The Tories don't believe Scotland to be an equal partner, but a second-class nation, worth only of second-class treatment. Throughout the entire negotiating period, the UK government has treated Scotland with contempt. And, you know, as I look around, and I can see shaking of heads, and I look at the chamber, I look in front of me. Where are the 13 Scottish Tory MPs that were to stand up for Scotland? In this debate, which is so crucial to Scotland's future, the Tories aren't just found wanting. They're simply not here. They've disappeared.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. He is making an incredibly powerful speech. Will he agree with me on a matter of respect and a matter of contempt for the Scottish people and for our Parliament? If this government and its MPs continue to treat Scotland with the kind of disrespect that we have seen throughout this Brexit process, it will only make independence for Scotland more likely and come sooner.
Good news.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that, and I will make a prediction to this Parliament that Scotland will become an independent country, and I'll say simply to the UK Parliament, keep going.
First Ambassador.
You know, since we've come here, we've had English votes for English laws, we've had the power grab that's taking place, and the people of Scotland will one day make their judgment on what is happening. Mr. Speaker, I want to make some progress because I'm aware that many other people want to speak.
Throughout the entire negotiating period, the UK Government has treated Scotland with contempt. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain, yet the will of the Scottish people means nothing, absolutely nothing, to this Prime Minister. Instead of engaging meaningfully with Scotland during this critical time, the Prime Minister chose last-minute photocalls and stage-managed events in Scotland, all smoke and mirrors, to dress up the fact that her government couldn't care less about Scotland, and we can see it tonight. The Tories think they can do whatever they want to Scotland and get away with it. They think they can railroad this deal against her will and against her interests. The mask has well and truly slipped for the Tories. Let me say this. Scotland is not a second-class nation, and our people do not deserve a second-class deal. This proposed deal is a non-starter, and a no-deal Brexit is unthinkable. That means the priority now must be to stop Brexit, and the SNP has made clear we will support any steps which would secure Scotland's place in the European Union, in line with the votes of the people of Scotland. But we've also said that if the UK is to leave the EU, by far away the least damaging option is to stay in the single market, which is 8 times bigger than the UK alone and the customs union.
He's been very clear. We know what he's saying. He wants to stay within the European Union. How's he going to get out of the common fisheries policy? And what's he going to do for Scottish fishermen?
Well. Scottish fishing. You know, the reason that Scottish fishing was sold down the river in the 1970s was because Ted Heath made sure that our fishing interests were sold out. And I have to say to him that, you know, in the deal that the government's brought forward, it's the worst of all deals, because in the transition period, the UK would remain in the Commons fisheries policy, but would have no effect on the rules. And if you look at what the European Union has made clear, because you're going to enter into a transition, but you're not holding any cards in terms of the future relationship, and the EU27 have said that the starting position for the negotiations of fishing will be one that they start from the existing quotas. The Scottish fishermen have been sold out, and they've been sold out by the Tories that have duped them that they are going to be taking back control of their waters. Nothing can be further from the truth. I'm now going to make some progress. However, not content with ignoring the Scottish Government's compromise option for 2 years, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, now wants to shut Scotland's voice out entirely. The Prime Minister can't go on ignoring Scotland. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow the Scottish Parliament will debate a cross-party motion that rejects this deal and a no-deal Brexit. Perhaps there are lessons for this place, because at Holyrood, parties have come together against a damaging Brexit, a consensus and a desire to work collectively to defend Scotland's interests. How many of the 13 Tory MPs from Scotland will stand up with us to defend Scotland's interests? Where are they?
Not one.
I think we know the answer from the failure of the Scottish Tory MPs to stand up against the power grab when Westminster voted to take back control from the Scottish Parliament. We saw then when our powers over fishing, farming and the environment were to be trampled all over by Westminster, and yet the Scottish Tories turned a blind eye. Scottish Tories standing silent as Scotland's Parliament, our Parliament, that the people of Scotland voted for in such huge numbers in 1997, had its powers constrained. The Prime Minister boasts that her deal has support, but I say the Prime Minister, her deal does not have the support of the people of Scotland. Mr. Speaker, a poll published earlier this year found that almost 2/3 of Scottish voters believe that the Westminster Government is ignoring their concerns during Brexit negotiations, and there is now more support in Scotland for remaining in the EU than at the time of the 2016 election. According to research for the People's Vote campaign, 66% of Scottish voters support staying in the EU. The Prime Minister, like her predecessors, is out of step with the feelings of the Scottish people. And it's not just Scottish people. Countless experts and professionals right across the UK
have said this is a bad deal. Mr Speaker, why is the Prime Minister not listening? The Prime Minister's proposed deal is unacceptable and it must be defeated in this House. 80,000 jobs will be put directly at risk in Scotland as a result of Brexit. And yeah, I can see ministers shaking their heads. But that's the analysis of the Fraser of Avondale, and indeed the UK government's own economic analysis points to the fact that a no-deal Brexit would damage the Scottish economy, would wipe out more than 8.5% of our GDP. How any government can impose these risks on Scotland is just simply breathtaking. The UK government's intention to end free movement of people will be hugely damaging to our economy.
Correct.
Inward migration has made an overwhelmingly positive contribution to Scotland's economy, meeting our needs for workers in sectors such as health and social care, as well as in the tourism industry in the Highlands and Islands. Any reduction in EU migration could have a serious effect on Scotland's population growth and its demographic composition. In Scotland, all of the projected increase in our population over the next 25 years is due to migration. According to the Scottish Fiscal Commission, with 50% less EU migration, the working age population would decline by almost 1%, and the proportion of children would be declined by 4.3%. This deal totally fails to meet Scotland's distinctive needs.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. Just an example of exactly what he's saying came to my ears today. There is a pilot who works for a Scottish airline who has a choice between having a strong EU Dutch passport or having a UK passport. Having a UK passport would mean he'll have to pay about £10,000 for himself and his wife and his children to stay in the UK, or leave him with a weaker passport, whereas he goes with a Dutch passport and works internationally in the airline industry. This is the very damage that the honourable gentleman is talking about, that this government does not care about. Whatever it will do to the transport infrastructure of the Highlands, they will carry on blindly as they've been going.
No, he's absolutely right. And we must make this point right across Scotland, that there is an existential threat to our living standards, to our workers, and we must make sure that we stop Brexit. And if we can't stop Brexit for the United Kingdom, then we've got to take our own responsibilities to protect Scotland.
Well said, Ian. Good on you.
Mr Speaker, Brexit uncertainty is already damaging our economy to the tune of £600 per household per year as the value of the pound falls and inflation rises. That's not Project Fear. That has happened. That's what's happened since we had the sheer responsibility of the Vote Leave campaign, with ridiculous statements on the side of a bus promoted by the ex-Foreign Secretary who should be hanging his head in shame.
I think he is.
There is no certainty on the PM's deal on future trading arrangement for goods or services, no certainty on future mobility, no clarity on law, and no guarantee on continued participation in EU funding programmes which support our universities, communities, NGOs and businesses. And uncertainty leads to risks for investment and further risks for our economy. By 2030, under a free trade agreement, GDP would be £9 billion lower than if we stayed in the European Union, equivalent to £1,600 per person in Scotland. That's what Brexit risks. Per year, making the people of Scotland poorer. That's why the Scottish National Party, in all good faith, has offered a compromise. If we're to be dragged out of the European Union against our will, then at the very least, Mr Speaker, we must remain in the single market and the customs union to protect our economy. Without single market and customs union membership, the future relationship can only be a free trade agreement, introducing barriers to Scottish companies' abilities to trade. This will damage jobs, investment, productivity and earnings. The government's own analysis proves that Brexit is bad for Scotland. Trade volumes, GDP and wages would all fall, while government borrowing and trade costs would increase. All the analysis shows that in a no-deal scenario, that it would be catastrophic, and it's likely that the corporate sector in general is not well equipped to deal with a no-deal Brexit.
Correct.
It is more important than ever that we're not faced with a false choice between a bad deal and a no-deal. We need to have more time. We must extend Article 50 and take an alternative route to protect our economy. This deal and no deal are not options. Only those reckless enough
to risk economic hardship will back this deal. Despite what the Prime Minister said here today, her own Chancellor agrees with the SNP when he admitted on Radio 4 that in economic terms we will be worse off after Brexit, after leaving the single market. Even more telling, Mr Speaker, is the admission from the Prime Minister herself in the House last week. The Prime Minister said in response to the member from Belfast North, what we want to be able to do is in the future be able to have our own independent trade policy. One of the issues in relation to the backstop is whether or not we would be able to do that, not one of the issues we would want to see continuing the backstop for. So the Prime Minister is clear. There's a concern from this government over their ability to be able to strike and implement free trade deals if the backstop comes into force. Why then is the Prime Minister here arguing that this deal delivers? Mr Speaker, again I ask this House, how could we support a deal and back the government on delivering an outcome that would make our economy smaller and our communities poorer? Mr Speaker, government ministers have tried to spin support in favour of this deal, citing the support from sectors across the United Kingdom. However, let me say this to those who believe that this deal is the only option. It is not, and we deserve better. Yeah. We know that frictionless trade at the border is crucial for Scotland's food and drink exports, but there is no guarantee of this, as under the deal, border checks and controls will depend on the extent of the UK's alignment with EU customs and regulatory regimes. Yet the declaration contains no commitment to a common rulebook on regulation. The SNP believes that our food and drink sector deserves assurance. They deserve cast-iron protections for their industry, not a false binary choice between a no Brexit and a blindfold Brexit. Yet again, another UK Tory government in Westminster has bargained off our fishing sector. Despite what utterances come from Number 10 as false assurances, the UK is reneging on its promises to support Scottish fishing by accepting a link between the UK waters and access to EU markets. Its commitment to a separate fisheries agreement as part of the economic partnership could mean the UK ceding access for EU vessels to UK waters or accepting tariffs and customs barriers on trade in fish, seafood and farmed salmon with the EU. That, Mr Speaker, is not acceptable. This will mean once again Scottish interests being traded off against each other. This is absolutely unacceptable, and those in the Scottish Tories who profess to want to protect Scottish fishermen should hang their heads in shame. If the Tories go through the lobbies to protect this government, they will have once again sold Scotland out for party political gain, and, Mr Speaker, they will not be forgiven for it. The UK government must respect the will of the Scottish people, who voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU. It is, Mr Speaker, a democratic outrage that Scotland has been dragged out of the European Union against its will. The Withdrawal Agreement sidelines Scotland and sells out our vital national industries. How could any representative in good conscience support such a move? Let me be clear. Next week, the SNP will reject the Withdrawal Agreement because it will leave Scotland poorer and rips opportunities away from future generations. Does the Prime Minister show any respect for our mandate at all? No. Does this government have respect for the fact that every Scottish local authority voted Remain and the nation voted 62% in favour of staying in the EU? No. Well, Mr Speaker, in Scotland we will make our voices heard once again. Northern Ireland has been given a differential deal that will put Scotland at a competitive disadvantage. There is no reason why a similar arrangement cannot be afforded to Scotland. The SNP will bring forward an amendment to ensure that in the place the voice of Scotland is well and truly heard. Those who claim to be Democrats, those who claim to have respect for the people of Scotland and for the mandate of the Scottish people and the Parliament cannot vote with the UK government on this deal. It is clearer now than ever before that the only way to protect Scotland's interest is to be an independent nation. Mr Speaker, the First Minister has been very clear that she will set out the next steps in Scotland's future once the terms of the Brexit deal are clear. The process of Brexit has demonstrated weaknesses in the UK's constitutional arrangements. Scotland has been ignored, sidelined
and undermined through the entire Brexit process. The cost to the people in Scotland of not being independent have been laid bare.
Just look at Ireland.
Mr. Speaker, today is a moment of huge historical significance. A moment that for decades to come, people will remember what this place decided to do if we as public representatives with the responsibility to protect our communities and constituents vote for a deal that will harm and hinder their opportunities, or if we stood up for them. Mr. Speaker, this is no ordinary time in our history, and it is no ordinary time for our politics. Brexit has cast the politics of Westminster into a landscape of crumbling certainties. We are at a defining moment. We must stand up for our constituents. We cannot ignore the economic analysis. We cannot drive blindfolded off the cliff edge. We must take back control in this place. We must have the courage of our convictions and yield the power gifted us to do the right thing. We must stop this deal and this government from railroading recklessly over our rights, our freedoms and the opportunities for our people. There is another way. There is time, and we must take it.
Sir Graham Brady. Order. Point of order, Mr. Alex Chalk.
Speaker, I'm sorry to trouble you with this, but yesterday, in the course of proceedings, you gently rebuked me for intervening from a sedentary position on the Honourable Lady for Brighton Pavilion. You went on to suggest that there had been general shouting and braying, and the Gloucestershire Echo is now reporting that I was admonished by you for participating in such behaviour. Would you be kind enough to confirm that there was no suggestion of braying or other disrespectful behaviour from me? It's not my style, and I would be grateful if the position could be clarified so that the record and the Echo can be set straight.
I'm very happy to set the record straight for the benefit of the honourable gentleman. In all my experience of the honourable gentleman, which is now quite considerable, I think I can say authoritatively that the honourable gentleman and braying are complete strangers. They have never met, and indeed, other than by virtue of the fact that he's a well-educated fellow, I would question whether he would even know the meaning of the word to bray.
Yeah.
He's, in every other respect, a good citizen, and he may have heckled, he did heckle, but he wasn't braying, and his behaviour is ordinarily not in any way unseemly. So he can tell his local newspaper to put that in their pipe if they still have one and smoke it. Sir Graham Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There may not be room in the Gloucestershire Echo for the whole of your ruling in response to my honourable friend's point. I'm very grateful to be called so early in this debate, Mr. Speaker. I will be brief out of consideration for the many members on both sides who wish to participate in this debate. But following the right honourable gentleman from Ross, Skye and Lochaber, I have to wonder how it is that he has apparently not realised that the British economy has been growing steadily since the vote to leave in the referendum in 2016. If the Scottish economy is failing in the way that he suggests, perhaps it's got something to do with the Scottish government and its failure to provide the services that are needed north of the border, not to do with the Brexit vote. He spoke at length about the tradition of democracy and respect for the rule of law. He called them European traditions without noting that they're actually strongest in this country, in Britain, and have been for a very, very long time. And I wonder if he would, not now, I wonder if he might reflect for a moment as he thinks about that respect for democracy and the rule of law, what damage can be done to that respect, to those values that are so precious in our country, if he and his friends were successful in ignoring the biggest democratic mandate in British history. Blimey, what a choice. From the Western Isles.
Oh, but it's just asserted. I hope you will reflect for just a tiny moment that Ireland, that became independent of the UK 96 years ago, this year will be growing 5 times faster. For further understanding of that, it's going to take the UK 5 years to do what Ireland does in 1 year.
As he will know, I'm sure, the fastest growing major European economy at the moment, and he also knows the difficulties that Ireland had some years ago as a result of its membership of the Euro, something which would be inflicted on Scotland by the nationalists if they had their way. Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to say this evening, I think the Prime Minister has enormous goodwill on both sides of the House. I think members on both sides know that she has worked phenomenally hard to try to secure the best agreement. I think she's also correct when she makes the point that the country feels ready to move on. There is palpable tiredness with this subject, and people, the length and breadth of the United Kingdom, want to know that we're going to move forward and put into effect that referendum that took place 2.5 years ago. And it's also important, as I listened earlier to the leader of the opposition, and he talked about fear and concern in business, that uncertainty was affecting investment in our country. I think it's important that members on both sides of the House also understand that if there is fear and uncertainty in boardrooms in this country, then it is because of the concern of what would happen if the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite were ever to form a government in this country. And if there is capital flight going on at the moment from our country, it is because of that concern, not because of concern about Brexit. Certainly, on this side of the House, we're in no doubt that it's better to have a Conservative government led by my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, than the alternative. But the more remarkable thing, now I think we've heard enough from the Scottish Nationalists for probably for the 5 days of the debate. But more remarkable, I think, perhaps, is the number of members in the Labour benches who feel that it would be much safer for the country to continue to have a Conservative government led by the Prime Minister than one. Go on.
Oh, no, really grateful. He says he hopes that his right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, will continue to see the deal through. But of course, only he knows if that's going to be the case. So can he enlighten us?
Knows perfectly well that I'm not going to enlighten him on that, although I could enlighten him on so many other things. There is so much, Mr. Speaker, that is good and sensible in the withdrawal agreement that is proposed. Crucially, I think the implementation period, which gives business a degree of certainty, the time to accommodate to changes, is critically important. Also, I think members on both sides absolutely welcome the mutual protection of citizens, which is embodied in it, something which has been very important to members on both sides of the House ever since the referendum over 2 years ago. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister was clear in her assessment when she said there are those members in this House who would like to see much closer integration than is proposed in the withdrawal agreement. There are those who would like to see a much looser relationship than is proposed. I'm firmly in the latter camp. I find much in the agreement disagreeable. I think it does propose to tie us in too closely to the European Union in the future. But like many in this House as well, I recognise that there is a need to compromise. I recognise that there is, at a time when we're negotiating with 27 other countries, at a time when there is no overall majority in this House of Commons, that some compromise is necessary. But, and this is really my one central point for my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, sitting on the Treasury bench now. I think, whilst recognising that compromise is necessary, there is one compromise beyond all others that makes this withdrawal agreement very difficult for many of us to support. It is the possibility, however remote, that we might be leaving a treaty that allows us to give notice to quit, to join one that can only be left with the consent of the other party. And to do that in the name of taking back control is something which is very difficult for many of us to accept. So over the next 7 days, can I urge my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, in the strongest possible terms, to redouble their efforts, to find a way to give real reassurance that we, the United Kingdom, could in future leave the backstop in the event that we have had to join it, and recognise that there has to be a point that if negotiation over a future trading arrangement were to break down, there has to be a way to leave that backstop agreement. We have 7 days of debate and discussion ahead of us. Many of us, if I can say to my right honourable friend, are hoping to hear that reassurance and are willing him and the Prime Minister well in that process.
Dame Margaret Beckett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 20 years ago, as the new President of the Board of Trade, my first overseas visit to a major trade partner, Japan, was dominated by their most overwhelming concern. Business and politicians alike wanted reassurance that the then new Labour government would not be leaving the European Union. They were polite, but they were blunt. They had invested in the UK because the UK was in the European Union. And if we left, so would they. And just today, their ambassador re-emphasised their nervousness. So in 2016, I could foresee serious economic harm to Britain's interests. But I accepted that we had to abide by the referendum result and concentrate our energies on damage limitation. Despite mixed messages from the government, I voted to trigger Article 50 and the process of withdrawal. But frankly, since then, it's been downhill all the way. First, it became clear that those who'd clamoured for us to leave the European Union hadn't the faintest idea what to do next. There was no concrete plan for the nation's future, just a series of sweeping assertions about how easy, swift and painless leaving would be and that a golden future awaited us. Then we saw that the Prime Minister's decisions were being taken not in the best interests of the country, but to satisfy her Brexit extremists. The withdrawal bill then proposed that the control that we were taking should be returned not to Parliament, but to ministers, with little, if any, real parliamentary scrutiny. Asserting Parliament's legitimate role has been an uphill struggle, as we saw in the most recent division today. Article 50 allows only a 2-year window for negotiations, so I expected the government to seek the fastest possible progress. I agreed with them that withdrawal and future partnership were best considered side by side. But when this was rejected, concluding negotiations on Part 1, the withdrawal agreement, became all the more urgent. Leaving is one thing. What matters more is where you're going and on what terms. And that dialogue has yet to begin in earnest. If anyone had said that we would reach the end of our 2-year window, struggling to reach any deal at all, I would never have believed it. But it's hard to negotiate successfully if you can't agree on what you want, willfully throw away your negotiating flexibility, and sack people who tell you what you don't want to hear. Over these 2 years, while the government has wrangled endlessly about how to proceed, one disastrously unforeseen consequence of leaving the EU after another has been revealed. Members opposite keep insisting that everyone who voted knew exactly what they were doing and what the possible consequences would be. It may be so. All I can say is, I didn't. When I heard the Prime Minister pontificating about escaping the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, it never crossed my mind that that meant leaving Euratom, the watchdog not just for cancer treatment, but for the safety of nuclear power stations. And I know from ministerial experience that we have and have had for years a shortage of people across the world who have those skills and capacities, and we are about to leave behind some of those on whom we presently rely. Although, whatever I didn't know, I did know how much we rely on Dover for our import and export trade. Nor, Mr. Speaker, had I focused on the losses to our scientific and medical research, or things like the Galileo project, and as each of these problems emerges, I keep hearing that it's all right because the government's going to continue all this investment, going, for example, also to support our farmers all on our own. So clearly the Prime Minister's found another of those magic money trees. Much of our consumption, for example, our food consumption, relies on the frictionless trade that we now enjoy. So too does modern manufacturing. Key goods and components are perpetually whizzing round the European Union and back to the UK, and thousands of jobs across Britain depend on this just-in-time delivery. That's why I was appalled to hear the Prime Minister announce casually that Britain would leave both the single market and the customs union, and what's more, that these were red lines. The economist, Professor Patrick Minford, declared the other day that just as the Thatcher years saw the demise of major industries like coal and steel, so too, leaving the EU, which he nevertheless supports, will probably, and in my view disastrously, see the end of what's left of UK manufacturing. I know that nevertheless, most of the business community urges us to vote for this deal, to provide the certainty that business always understandably seeks. I understand that totally. I have dealt with it for years. But no one should be under any illusions. These are not, bluntly, commitments to invest or stay in Brexit Britain. These are perfectly justifiable attempts to keep business going for the next 2 to 3 years, to give them a breathing space without disruption to make their long-term decisions, which may not be in our favour. I recognise, too, the concern that staying in a customs union may restrict our ability to negotiate other trade deals, say, with the United States. Personally, I am not starry-eyed about such deals. For a start, it's frankly inconceivable that any American president, let alone this American president, would do a trade deal with the UK without making it a key condition that giant US health corporations be allowed unfettered access to our National Health Service. I can well imagine that that might suit some right-wingers who hanker after a privatised NHS and would see those companies use a free trade deal to accomplish exactly that, along with other public services, but leaving the hands of Tory politicians clean. Equally, we'd face demands to admit chlorine-washed chicken and hormone-fed beef, and no doubt other delights on which we have not yet focused. Nor are other trade deals consequence-free. India and China, to name but two, would, again, understandably want additional visas for their citizens. I have no quarrel with that. But the Prime Minister's emphasis on the end of free movement may give some the misleading expression that an end to immigration is what she is offering. It's not. And in the most recent figures, it's actually non-EU immigration which is increasing. Then, not satisfied with the grave red lines misjudgment, tying her own hands, restricting her room for manoeuvre, the Prime Minister added the crass folly of selecting a date, and not just a date, a time for our leaving, and to please and reassure her Brexiteers, put it on the face of the bill. It was as that self-inflicted deadline approached that some began to say it would be best to leave the European Union at the end of March, giving up our prime negotiating cards and our strength, and work out afterwards what would be in our interests in the future. I don't think I have ever heard anything so criminally irresponsible from any government or from the supporters of any government. The Prime Minister says people just want it to be over. Of course they do. Heaven knows, I think we probably all share that sentiment. But it's a con. It's perhaps the biggest con of all. If we pass this deal in this House, it won't be over. The really serious stuff hasn't even started. And it's going to go on for years. To guide us, there we have, of course, the political declaration. And we've already heard from the governments of France and Spain how binding they believe its warm words to be. But the point is, it settles nothing. All is to be explored, or continued, considered, or discussed. Nothing is settled. From the outset, the Prime Minister resisted the idea that this sovereign parliament should have the chance to vote and express its opinion on any deal she might secure. She forcefully resisted the notion of a meaningful vote, and now we have one. She's doing her utmost to make it meaningless by insisting there's only one way for MPs to vote, which is for her deal. The outcome of this series of votes is unpredictable and could well be indecisive. I have seen such a thing happen in this House before. So should there now be a further people's vote? I hear no from most of the benches opposite. But I'm in no doubt. I know infinitely more now about the potential consequences of leaving the European Union than I did in 2016. And I think, having been in the Cabinet for some 11 years, I probably knew a little bit about it before. And I know, too, that what Leave campaigners promised is not on offer, mostly because it was undeliverable. The honourable members for Totnes and Bracknell have reminded us that a major medical intervention must be preceded by an assurance that informed consent has been given. Consumer protection law gives a 14-day cooling-off period for people to make sure they know what they're doing. And this time, the very future of our country is at stake. There's been a determined effort to keep people in the dark. Economic assessments of Brexit's impact prepared for ministers were withheld, like the government's legal advice. The real-life full consequences of leaving with no deal, which clearly still attracts some on the benches opposite, are not being fully spelt out. The Chancellor, like the Governor of the Bank of England, publicly accepts that we would be economically better off to stay in the European Union. But he points out, and this is fair, that many who voted Leave thought that a price worth paying to recover our sovereignty. But the deal on offer, as the Prime Minister says, the only deal on offer, does not recover our sovereignty. It leaves us rule takers from the European Union without any voice in shaping those rules. It represents what may well be the biggest transfer of sovereignty ever proposed by any British government, because this time sovereignty is not being shared, it's being surrendered. None of us can know today just what decisions, what options, if any, will emerge from next Tuesday's votes. The Prime Minister demands, she repeated it today, of all MPs that when we vote, we do so not in any party or personal interest, but for what we honestly believe to be the interests of our country. I shall, Mr. Speaker, and it will not be for this deal.
Thank you. Order. With immediate effect, an 8-minute limit will now apply. Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker, and it may be that I can actually shorten my comments because I want wholeheartedly and thoroughly to adopt the outstanding and excellent analysis and conclusions from the Right Honourable Member for Derby South. She does indeed speak with great authority, and she, of course, herself knows, as a proud representative of the city of Derby and in her own constituency, the Rolls-Royce plant. She also knows the Toyota plant that exists near to Derby. So when she speaks about the just-in-time supply chains, when she speaks about our manufacturing, I would suggest there are few who could speak with so much genuine authority and knowledge. And in her analysis, as I say, and in her conclusions, she is absolutely right. And I'm delighted that she and I also agree that we should now have a people's vote on this, the most important decision that our country will take and face for decades. And Mr. Speaker, I also want to say this. You, I think, understand, perhaps more than many, but how that consensus, that agreement was here in this House shortly after the referendum result. And the great failing, and it gives me no pleasure to say this of my own government, the great failing was from the outset, when instead of reaching out across this House and across our country to heal the divisions, to bring together the 48 and the 52, I'm afraid and sorry to say the exact opposite was done. The 48% were tossed aside, we were abused, we were sidelined. If we had even the temerity to question almost anything, we were called Ramonas. It is supremely ironic that it is because of brave colleagues who normally sit here in what's called the naughty chamber, who about a year ago stood up to the abuse, the calls of calling us traitors and mutineers, and yes, the death threats. And we actually voted, I think with some courage, for what is now happening today to enable honourable members to debate in the way that they will and then to vote. And the irony of it is not lost on me that some of those who were most ardent in their opposition to what we did 12 months ago are now the most keen to take advantage of it. Mr. Speaker, I will not vote for this deal on any other basis than it goes to the people for their approval. This is not a good deal. In fact, it's not a deal, as many have already observed. It's certainly not what we were promised, not even by our Prime Minister, who shortly after the triggering of Article 50 was interviewed, by way of example, by Andrew Marr. The tape exists. He questioned whether it would be possible in the next 2 years to begin to get anywhere near securing, or just even to the beginning stage, of all the various deals that had to be secured. And she was confident it all could be done within 2 years. Well, here we are today, and what do we know? We have a political declaration which can be ripped up by any Prime Minister or any government that comes in once we've left the European Union. The Withdrawal Agreement is the only legally binding part of this so-called deal. As we know, there is nothing to implement, certainly nothing that we were promised. The so-called transition period is to an unknown destination because after 2.5 years, we still do not know what our eventual relationship with the European will be, and that's simply not good enough. The Withdrawal Agreement is indeed a blindfolded Brexit which fails to deliver on the promises not made just by the Leave campaign, but also, I am sorry to say, by my own government. And as the Right Honourable Lady for Derby South has said so beautifully and eloquently, honourable and right honourable members on this side of the House who think that this will all be over. We just get on with it, just do it. And we'd all go home for Christmas and it'll all be over. With great respect, you are completely and utterly fooling yourselves. We've already heard speeches about those who prefer a no-deal, hard Brexit. You can be assured that if we leave next March with nothing more than this withdrawal agreement and this political declaration that can be torn up, they will carry on and on and on for years in their quest to sever all ties with the European Union. And as I say, they will do it because of the non-binding nature of the political declaration. And how poor is that political declaration? As others have already observed, it is so vague that the government couldn't even apply its assessments to it to try and inform us of the financial consequences of it. And of course I'll give way.
Would you agree with me that this is actually exemplified in Article 107 of the Future Framework on Space, where it just says the parties should consider appropriate arrangements for cooperation on space. That is it.
Indeed it is. It is nothing more than warm words of good intentions, but there's no mention now of the frictionless trade which we were all promised. Services, which make up 80% of our economy, barely get a mention. And of course the political declaration is the high point as we now go into entering negotiations in March. But the worst part of the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration is that it will make our constituents and our country poorer. And I did not come to this place, and I will not vote for anything that makes my constituents poorer, especially when a far better alternative exists. On its own admission, this government is urging people to vote for this so-called deal in the clear knowledge it will reduce the future economic prospects of the people of this country, and that is on their best assessments, or rather guesses, because we know of the inherent problems and the inaccuracy, in effect, of the impact assessments and the forecasts that have made. They just give us the best. In fact, many believe it will be far worse than even those estimates have given. No one should be under any illusions of how bad a place the backstop will be, and I won't rehearse some of the arguments that have been very well put forward by others. It's not just vassalage. It will convey only a bare-bones customs union, none of the regulatory alignment that is so critical for business. Northern Ireland will indeed have limited benefits, but there'll be better benefits than the rest of the United Kingdom, which is clearly a threat to the union of our country. And I say to people on these benches, as members of the Conservative and Unionist Party, on what possible basis can you vote for that? As others have observed, we'll not be able to deliver any of the unicorn trade deals that have so far eluded us, but apparently will magically appear in the next 2 years, nor will we indeed be it seems, be able to benefit from the dozens of great trade deals that we already have because we are a member of the European Union. And that is the reality of it, Mr. Speaker. This is not what Leave voters in Broxtowe voted for. They've seen through the lies on buses, and they now know of the broken promises. They see that whichever way you cut it, Brexit will make them poorer and reduce the life chances of their children and their grandchildren. And they're entitled now that they see the reality of Brexit to change their minds and have a final say by way of a people's vote. Now, it is said it's a price worth paying, but I reject that, Mr. Speaker, because I understand the political consequences, as many say, about the need to deliver this. But we, all of us, have to put our country and our constituents first. And if we do that, we will see and understand the best deal we have is the current deal that we have with the European Union. It's not just good for trade, it's also about the country that we are, open-minded, open-hearted, and I fear for our country if we set course now and agree to this deal and make the grave mistake of leaving the European Union that has conveyed so much prosperity and delivered peace and a better country.
Thank you. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Next Tuesday will be the House's opportunity
to have our say, and I rise to move Amendment C that stands in my name and that of my right honourable and honourable friends of colleagues. I want to begin by acknowledging the effort that ministers, the Prime Minister, civil servants have put into trying to negotiate a deal, and to say that the fact that so many of us object to what has been brought back is not a reflection on that effort, it is a reflection on the decisions that the government has made. Firstly, as we have heard, the government embarked on the negotiations with the cries of those who argued for Brexit ringing in their ears. And we need to remember the point my right honourable friend for Derby South made. We will hold all the cards. This will be one of the easiest trade deals in history. Getting out of the EU can be quick and easy. Within 2 years, we can negotiate a free trade area massively larger than the European Union. How slowly the truth has been revealed and how painful a process it has been. Secondly, while the referendum result made clear we're leaving the institutions, it did not determine the future of our economic relationship. Thirdly, and I believe that history will record the Prime Minister's red lines to have been an absolutely catastrophic mistake, because they created the problem of the border in Northern Ireland. It created the problem, and it removed the government's room for manoeuvre. It boxed the Prime Minister in, and it was the result of those illusions, these decisions, and the plague of disagreement that affected the Cabinet led to so many ministerial resignations, including the loss of not one but two Brexit secretaries. Goodness me, they exited the department before we even exited the European Union. The government spent 2 years trying to agree on what to ask for, and the result was the contortion that was the Chequers proposal in an attempt to try and keep that border open, to save friction-free trade. The problem was it was rejected by the European Union, and now is the time. The Prime Minister spoke about home truths. Now is the time for some honesty. If we wish to maintain an open border in Northern Ireland, then we will be staying in a customs union and observing most, if not all, of the rules of the single market. But not a single government minister is prepared to acknowledge that truth. The truth is also that those, and it was demonstrated, I have to say, by the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip in his contribution, those who argue for Brexit have been exposed as having absolutely no plan for it at all. A Canada deal would fail to solve the problem of Northern Ireland, a Canada deal would not give us friction-free trade, and as to the suggestion we should leave the EU on WTO terms, which is no deal, I'll return to that in a moment. The problem with this deal is the political declaration. We were assured it would be substantive and detailed. It is not. It is merely words and aspirations that have no legal force. We have no idea where we're going, no idea where we're going to end up, no clarity, no certainty, and for businesses which hate uncertainty, and for future investment which hates uncertainty, what kind of deal is that? The Prime Minister was questioned by my right honourable friend who chairs the Home Affairs Select Committee about security. She was asked why there's no reference to ECRIS and SIS2 in the deal. Do you know what? In 2016, we made 100,000 requests to ECRIS, the police in Britain. In 2017, 500,000 queries to the Schengen Information System 2. Now that tells us how important those two sources of information are to the protection of our security. Neither of them is mentioned in the political declaration. And what about services, foreign policy coordination, policing and information sharing, taking part in EU agencies, fisheries, data, recognition of professional qualifications, broadcasting rights, intellectual property, public procurement, consumer safety, aviation, freight, energy, medicine, scientific cooperation, and lots of other things. What's the answer on all of those? We don't know. Can't be sure. Yet to be sorted out. And the truth is, Mr. Speaker, that that will not do. I turned, secondly, to no deal. The figures we saw last week published by the Treasury, the reduction in GDP that would result compared to what would otherwise happen, they are very sobering and they speak for themselves. And I'm sorry to say that those who try and wave that all away by saying, well, it wouldn't be the end of the world, there would be some disruption initially, simply failed to do justice to the economic consequences of taking such a highly damaging step, and they pay no heed at all to the fears of concerns of businesses who know it would be a disaster, and they do not respect the importance of the Good Friday Agreement and that open border in Northern Ireland. Of course I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and gentleman for giving way. Would he agree with me that it is at best unfortunate that the slogan was used that no deal was better than a bad deal, when in fact no deal is the very worst thing that could happen to our country? It was verging on being irresponsible.
Honourable Lady, completely. It has been a nonsense that the government advanced for the last 2 years, and ministers know that we cannot leave with no deal. They know that we are not ready. I don't think any responsible government would allow this country to leave the EU with no deal. But they are unwilling to say that because no deal has to be kept alive as the bogeyman to frighten the House of Commons into voting for the Prime Minister's deal. Now, Mr. Speaker, I will briefly, yes.
I'm most grateful to him for giving way. Would he also agree that no deal would have serious repercussions for our politics, but also for our relations with our European neighbours by cutting ourselves off in this way?
It absolutely would. And I do not believe that there is a majority in this House for leaving with no deal, and we will have an opportunity to demonstrate in our vote next week. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is a decision that is going to define this generation of members of Parliament and shape the future for our children and our grandchildren. And the truth is that from the very beginning, our nation has been divided on the subject of Europe. From Hugh Gaitskell's speech about the end of 1,000 years of British history to Edward Heath's argument that joining the common market was a great step forward towards the removal of divisions in Western Europe, from Harold Wilson's renegotiation and referendum to David Cameron's, the British people have shown support for and reticence about Europe in almost equal measure. Now, I argued for remaining in the European Union not because it is perfect. It is far from perfect. It needs reform. And the referendum told us that the rise of populism across Europe, the vote here, is telling governments that too many people feel that the balance between sovereignty, self-determination, control, call it what you will, and cooperation with other countries is not quite right. And that thirst for control is a reflection of the lack of control that many of our constituents feel they have over their lives, what has happened to their jobs and the changes that they have seen. But at this moment in our history, in this century, working with our neighbours and with our friends is an absolute necessity if we are going to address the great challenges that all of us on this small and fragile planet face. Trade, dealing with threats to peace and security, preventing the climate of our Earth running out of control with devastating consequences for all of the people that we represent, dealing with the tide of humanity that is travelling across the globe in search of a better life. Now, I will not dissemble and I will not pretend. I think that leaving the European Union is a terrible mistake. It will damage our economy and discourage investment. It will hurt our constituents. It will make it much more difficult to do something about the many reasons why people voted to leave. It will reduce our influence in the world, and it will disregard the extraordinary achievement of the European ideal in bringing peace to the continent on which centuries of war had seen blood shed for no purpose and generation after generation laid beneath the earth. And in this centenary year, the end of the First World War, we should remember that as well as remembering them. Mr. Speaker, we have to deal with the position that we find ourselves in, and my final plea to the House is this. Now is the moment to tell each other the truth. We owe that to a nation that has shown itself to be divided almost exactly down the middle. We have to bear in mind our responsibility to the 48% as well as to the 52%, and no one is going to get out of this mess everything that they wanted. No one is going to get everything they thought they would get. No one is going to receive all the things they were told that they would receive. All of us are going to have to compromise, and we're going to have to find a way forward that a majority can agree upon. And the reason I would ask the House next week, if it is selected to vote for my amendment, is that the sooner we are able to say to the government, in respect of the motion that is put before us, we're not prepared to support that, we're not prepared to leave with no deal, the sooner it seems to me that we can move forward and find a solution to this problem in the time that remains, and thanks to the amendment successfully moved by the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield earlier today, the House can at least end this debate secure in the knowledge that as and when that time comes, we will have the opportunity to have our say, and so it should be.
Order. I'm extremely grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman. He began his speech by saying that he was moving his amendment, and I know what he meant was that he was speaking to it. Simply for the avoidance of doubt, I should emphasise to the House that under the motion agreed earlier today, that is to say the business of the House motion, in respect of which the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman, the member for Beaconsfield, did indeed move an amendment, no amendment will be selected by me until next Tuesday, and it will be on that day, of course, that the votes take place. I say that simply for purposes of clarification. Still with the 8-minute limit, Sir Roger Gale.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker, and it's always a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Leeds Central. I don't agree with everything that he said, but let me start with a point of definite agreement, which is that the European Union needs reform. I personally believe that the European Union is corrupt. I believe it is bureaucratic. I believe it is meddlesome. I believe it is wasteful. But for all of that, I voted Remain. And I voted Remain because I believe that my children and my grandchildren and my constituents' children and grandchildren would be better off within than out with the European Union in terms of the economy and security. That is how I voted, but unfortunately 52% of the British public did not. And I have accepted that result, and I understand that others take a different view and would like to rerun the referendum or have a people's vote or try and overturn the decision. But I believe that we do have a duty now to honour the express wish of the British people, and for that reason I shall be supporting the withdrawal agreement. It isn't perfect, no compromise ever is. But I listened very carefully to what the Attorney General said yesterday, and his words, I paraphrase slightly, were that it is a risk, but a risk that we have to take when you consider all of the alternatives. And if you look at all the alternatives, and I tried to goad my Right Honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge, into offering one this evening and got nothing. If you look at the alternatives, if you look at the hard Brexit, and if you have to rule out, as I do, a return to no Brexit, then we are left with the withdrawal agreement. I believe that my Right Honourable friend, the Prime Minister, was absolutely correct in saying that it is not possible to go back to the Commission cap in hand and see, OK, we might get a tweak here and a tweak there. But the idea that anybody is going to offer a radical reassessment of what is on offer today, I think is baying at the moon. I spend a certain amount of time leading the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe delegation, and I meet with European parliamentarians and have done in the past few weeks. They are astonished looking through the other end of the telescope at how much has been given to the United Kingdom. And I think my Right Honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is absolutely right to say that if she goes and tries to reopen the deal, then 27 other countries will all say me too. And then we shall have a raft of changes that will not be to our advantage. So for all that it is not perfect, I shall support it. I just want to touch briefly on the hard Brexit because this is part of my equation and now I need to be parochial. I'm proud to be a Member of Parliament representing the Garden of England, representing Kent. Other people don't seem to have grasped this fact, but quite a lot of trade does come through Dover and into the rest of the country and goes out. The fact of the matter is that probably 20 years ago, 85% of the lorries going out were British. Now, 85% of the lorries coming in and going out are continental. A hard Brexit means a hard border. We've heard a lot about hard borders in Northern Ireland, but we haven't heard about hard borders in England. The hard border between Dover and Calais. That shutter will come down. There will be controls if we go for a hard Brexit. I'm told, we visited the Dover Harbour Board last week, we spoke with the Freight Transport Association, the Kent Members of Parliament, with Kent County Constabulary, I spoke personally with a freight forwarder. If those shutters come down, the traffic backs up at about a mile an hour. That's out of the port of Dover, up the M20, up the M26, onto the M25, and then we are stuffed. The M25 comes to a grinding halt, South London comes to a grinding halt, and soon Birmingham will come to a grinding halt. No car parts for the just-in-time car industry, no life-saving pharmaceuticals, construction materials, rock wool comes through Dover, which is used extensively in construction, and food. Now, the good people of North Somerset, Mr. Speaker, and the good people of Uxbridge may not care whether Kent is turned into a lorry park, but I do. But what I also know is that the people of Somerset and the people of Uxbridge will scream blue murder when they find that they can't buy their new Chelsea tractor, or their life-saving drugs, or the foodstuffs that they enjoy that come in from mainland Europe. And you'll hear those screams from the West Country and West London to Westminster. We have, to me, one choice. We actually have three. But I've ruled out no Brexit because I believe that is not what people voted for. I've had to rule out, for the reasons I've just given, hard Brexit. I believe that it will be immensely damaging. Now, my miserable maths, 2 out of 3 leaves 1. And that 1 is the withdrawal agreement that will be before us on Tuesday night. I believe that I owe it to my constituents' children and grandchildren to vote for it, get behind it, and then let this great country move forward. And that is what I shall do on Tuesday.
Well, extraordinarily grateful to the honourable gentleman. Sir Vincent Cable.
Speaker, I wish to say a few words on behalf of the Liberal Democrat position that we should have a people's vote with the option to remain in the European Union, and we shall campaign to remain in the European Union. We believe unambiguously that that is in the national interest and the right thing to do. I start from, I think I'm one of the relatively few people left in the House who actually campaigned to join the European Union before we did so, and indeed in support of membership during the Wilson referendum. And it was my privilege at the time to campaign alongside some very fine British and Scottish statesmen like Joe Grimmond, John Mackintosh, and perhaps above all John Smith, who strongly believed that Britain's future lay in the European Union. And I think John Smith in particular would be pleased with the amendment that my Liberal Democrat colleagues have put down, which fully endorses the Labour Party amendment, but adds a small section which the leader of the Labour Party either forgets or is embarrassed to refer to, and in which we say, including a public vote as endorsed by the Labour Party conference. I notice he didn't mention that this evening. But my other relevant experience, I think, which I shared with the member for Derby South, is of having worked as President of the Board of Trade for 5 years in the coalition government. And I think there were several important lessons from that experience. The first was the importance to Britain, and I think this was recognised by both parties in the coalition and the Labour Party, of Britain's membership of the single market. It stemmed originally from an insight in the 1980s, and Mrs Thatcher originally taken up by the Blair government, that the future of the British economy lay with services, not just financial services, but services more generally, was something Britain had a considerable competitive advantage in, and this is something in the national interest to promote, and we did so. And we lectured countries like Germany, which were dragging their feet on things like mutual recognition of professional qualifications. And at the end of this campaigning for the single market, I remember back in 2015, we reached a provisional understanding on a digital single market, very much in the interests of Britain's emerging digital economy and creative industries. And the Prime Minister herself has said quite recently that this is something that Britain should be part of, until it was pointed out that she cannot be part of it if we leave the single market. And I think the other major lesson of that period was coming from having negotiated with General Motors over Ellesmere Port and Luton, with Ford over its plants in the UK, with Toyota, with Jaguar Land Rover, its expansion, with Airbus over its big investments here, with Siemens over its investments in wind turbines, in each case them making it absolutely clear that they were making their investments in the UK manufacturing sector in order to be part of the wider European market. And many of those investors who invested here in very good faith now feel somewhat betrayed. The Japanese have said this very clearly. They have been told by successive governments that the future of their investment here depended on membership of the European Union single market, and it would be maintained. But looking forward, it seems to me there are overwhelming arguments for remaining members of the European Union. Some of them have been expressed, arguments about peace, a point made by the member for Leeds Central, high environmental standards, but the fundamental point is the impact on our living standards. It has been acknowledged even by the government in the last 2 weeks as a result of its assessment that however Brexit is constructed, we will be worse off by leaving the European Union. We can have different scenarios and different assumptions, but there are none which show that we will actually benefit from leaving the European Union. We can see the signs of this already in what has happened since 2016. The biggest devaluation since the Second World War, cutting real incomes, the stifling of business investment, the decline in productivity. These things will continue on a bigger scale. We're offered the fantasy of a clutch of trade deals. We just need to look at this in terms of what this actually means. There will be some trade deals that can be negotiated. Small countries in the Caribbean will certainly sign up for trade deals to get better access for their bananas and sugar. Some countries will find it relatively easier to come to an agreement. Japan, Korea, Canada, which already have agreements with the European Union, so we gain nothing from them. Yes, I'll take an intervention.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Does he share my concern about the participation in the world-leading Horizon 2020 programme and the Horizon Europe programme to follow? When I questioned the Prime Minister last week at the Liaison Committee, there was absolutely no clarity as to whether we would be part of that successor programme, which is absolutely vital for our science base in this country.
Yes, he's absolutely right, and he speaks with the authority of his select committee. And many universities are potentially amongst the biggest casualties of Brexit precisely for that reason.